The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo. On the morning of the 6th of January, 1482, the Parisians were awakened by a grand peal from all the bells within the triple enclosure of the city, the university, and the town. This 6th of January was a double holiday, united since time immemorial, the Epiphany, or Feast of the Kings, and the Feast of the Fools. To celebrate such a day there was to be a bonfire kindled on the Place de Grève, and a maypole raised at the Chapelle de Braque. A mystery play was to be performed in the great hall of the Palace of Justice, and it was known that the Flemish ambassadors, who had arrived 2 days previously to conclude the marriage treaty between the young Dauphin and Margaret of Flanders, intended to be present not only at the performance of the mystery, but also at the election of the Fool's Pope, which was likewise to take place there. On that day, it was no easy matter to make one's way into the great hall. The open square in front of the palace, thronged with people, presented to the gazers from the windows the aspect of a sea, into which 5 or 6 streets, like the mouths of so many rivers, every moment discharged fresh floods of human heads. If the listener now represents to himself this vast hall, visible in the pale light of a January day, filled with a motley and noisy mob drifting along the walls and eddying around the 7 pillars, he will have some faint idea of the picture in general. Towards the middle of the hall, opposite the main entrance, a balcony, covered with gold brocade, backed by the wall, and accessible by a private entrance from a corridor opening into the gilded chamber, had been erected for the special honour of the Flemish envoys and the other grand personages invited to the representation of the mystery. This entertainment was to be given, according to ancient customs, on the marble table where all the preparations had been made since the morning. The play was not to begin until the great clock of the palace had struck the last stroke announcing noon. This was, no doubt, rather late for a mystery, but as ambassadors were to be present, their convenience was to be regarded. When the clock struck 12, there was a great shuffling about, a great movement of feet and heads, a general detonation of coughing and blowing of noses. Each one arranged himself, posted himself to the best advantage, raised himself on his toes. Then there was a deep silence, every neck remaining outstretched, every mouth open, every eye turned toward the marble table. But nothing appeared. The bailiff's 4 sergeants still kept their posts, as stiff and motionless as if they'd been 4 painted statues. All eyes then turned toward the gallery reserved for the Flemish envoys. The door remained shut, and the gallery empty. The multitude had been waiting since the early morning for 3 things, that is to say, for the hour of noon, for the Flemish embassy, and for the mystery, but only the first of the 3 had arrived on time. This was really too bad. They waited 1, 2, 3, 5 minutes, a quarter of an hour, but nothing came. The gallery remained empty, the stage mute. Meanwhile, impatience was succeeded by displeasure. The multitude clapped their hands. "The mystery!" they all shouted, and "Let Flanders go to all the devils!" This was enough. A music of high and low-keyed instruments now struck up underneath the stage. The hangings were lifted, and 4 characters in motley attire, with painted faces, issued forth, drew up in line before the audience, whom they saluted with a profound obeisance, whereupon the musical sound ceased, and the mystery began. In all that assemblage, upon which the 4 allegorical personages seemed to be striving which could pour out the most copious floods of metaphor, no ear was so attentive, no heart so palpitating, no eye so eager, no neck so outstretched, as were the eye, ear, neck, and heart of the author of the play, the poet, the brave young man, Pierre Gringoire. He had retired behind his pillar, and there it was that he listened, looked, and enjoyed. It pains us to relate this first ecstasy was very soon disturbed. The door of the reserved gallery, which had until then been so inopportunely shut, opened inopportunely, and the stentorian voice of the usher abruptly announced, "His Eminence, Monsieur the Cardinal of Bourbon." He entered, saluted the company with that hereditary smile which the great have always in readiness for the people, and moved slowly towards his armchair of crimson velvet placed for his reception, looking as if some other matter occupied his mind. The Flemish embassy made its appearance in the gallery almost at the same time as himself, all with severe and respectable countenances, akin to those which Rembrandt has made stand out with such force and gravity from the dark background of his picture of The Night Watch. The cardinal bit his lip. He leaned toward the abbot of Sainte-Geneviève, who sat next to him, and said in a half-whisper, "Pleasant ambassadors, truly, Monsieur the Archduke sends us to announce the Lady Margaret." "May these rogues go on with their farce?" asked the bailiff of the palace. Go on," said the cardinal. "'Tis all the same to me. I shall read my breviary the while." The bailiff advanced to the edge of the gallery, and shouted, after procuring silence by a motion of his hand, "Townsmen, householders, and inhabitants, to satisfy those who will that the play should begin again, and those who will that it should finish, His Eminence orders that it shall go on." The characters on the stage accordingly took up their text where they'd left off, and Gringoire hoped that at least the remainder of his composition would be listened to. This hope, however, was soon dispelled like the rest of his illusions. The actors were going on bravely when one of the Flemish party rose suddenly, and Gringoire heard him deliver, in the midst of the universal attention to his piece, this abominable harangue. "Messieurs, the citizens and squires of Paris, by the Holy Rood, I know not what we are doing here. I do indeed see, down in that corner, upon that stage, some people who look as if they wanted to fight. I know not whether that be what ye call a mystery, but I know that 'tis not amusing. This is not what I was told it was to be. I'd been promised a feast of fools, with an election of the Lord of Misrule. We at Ghent, too, have our fool's pope, and in that, by the rood, we're behind nobody. But we do thus. A mob comes together, as here, for instance. Then each in turn goes and puts his head through a hole and makes faces at the others. He who makes the ugliest face, according to general acclamation, is chosen pope. That's our way, and it's very diverting. Shall we make you a pope after the fashion of my country?" Gringoire would fain have replied, but amazement, resentment, and indignation deprived him of utterance. Besides, the motion was received with such enthusiasm by those townsfolk, flattered at being called squires, that all resistance would have been unavailing. All he could do now was to go with the stream. In the twinkling of an eye, everything was ready for putting the idea into execution. Townspeople, students, and clerks had all set themselves to work. The small chapel, situated opposite to the marble table, was fixed upon to be the scene of the grimaces. The glass being broken out of one of the divisions of the pretty rose-shaped window over the doorway, left free a circle of stone, through which it was agreed that the candidates should pass their heads. The grimaces commenced. The first face appeared at the hole, then a second face, and a third succeeded, then another, the spectators each time laughing and stamping their feet with delight. The scene became more and more Flemish. The Grand Salle had become, as it were, one vast furnace of audacity and joviality, in which every mouth was a shout, every face a grimace, every figure a posture, the sum total howling and roaring. Suddenly there was a great thunder of applause, mingled with prodigious exclamation. The Lord of Misrule was at last elected. It was indeed a miraculous grin that now beamed through the Gothic aperture. A tetrahedron nose, a horseshoe mouth, a small left eye overshadowed by a red bushy brow, while the right eye disappeared entirely under a monstrous wart. Straggling teeth with breaches here and there like the battlements of a fortress, a horny lip over which one of those teeth projected like the tusk of an elephant, a forked chin, and above all, an expression diffused over the whole, a mixture of malice, astonishment, and melancholy. Imagination alone can picture this combination. The acclamation was unanimous. The crowd precipitated itself towards the chapel, and the happy lord of misrule was led out in triumph. And now the surprise and admiration of the people redoubled. They found the wondrous grin to be but his ordinary face, or rather his whole person was a grimace. His large head, bristling with red hair, between his shoulders an enormous hump, to which he had a corresponding projection in front, a framework of thighs and legs so strangely gone astray that they touched only at the knees, and when viewed in front looked like two sickles joined together by the handles, sprawling feet, monstrous hands, and yet, with all that deformity, a certain awe-inspiring vigour, agility and courage, strange exception to the everlasting rule which prescribes that strength, like beauty, shall result from harmony. Such was the Pope whom the fools had just chosen. One would have said a giant that had been broken and awkwardly mended. When this sort of cyclop appeared on the threshold of the chapel, motionless, squat, almost as broad as he was high, the populace recognized him at once by his coat, half red and half violet, figured over with little silver bells, and still more by the perfection of his ugliness, and exclaimed with one voice, "It's Quasimodo, the bell-ringer! It's Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame!" During all this scene, Gringoire and his piece had held out. His actors, goaded on by himself, had not ceased spouting their parts, nor had he ceased to listen. But when he saw Quasimodo and the noisy train of the fool's Pope march with great clamour out of the hall, the rest of the crowd rushing eagerly after them, he made his retreat, hanging his head, but the last in the field, like a general who has fought well. The night comes on early in January. The streets were already growing dark when Gringoire quitted the palace. He took a resolution to go to the Place de Grève. At least, thought he, I shall perhaps get a brand to warm my fingers at the bonfire, and I shall manage to sup on some morsel from the public refectory. Accordingly, he hurried toward the bonfire, which burned magnificently in the middle of the place. A considerable crowd, however, encircled it. In a wide space left clear between the fire and the crowd, a young girl was dancing. Whether she was a human being, a fairy, or an angel, was what Gringoire, sceptical philosopher and ironical poet as he was, could not at the first moment decide, so much was he fascinated by this dazzling vision. She was not tall, but the elasticity of her slender shape made her appear so. She was a brunette, but it was obvious that in the daylight her complexion would have that golden gleam seen upon the women of Spain and of Rome. Every look was fixed upon her. Every mouth was open in the circle about her. And indeed, while she danced to the sound of the tambourine, which her two round and delicate arms lifted above her head, slender, fragile, active as a wasp, with her golden girdle without a fold, her skirt of varied colours swelling out below her slender waist, giving momentary glimpses of her fine-formed legs, her round, bared shoulders, her black hair and her sparkling eyes, she looked like something more than human. Among the thousand faces tinged by the scarlet light, there was one which seemed to be more than all the rest absorbed in the contemplation of the dancer. It was the face of a man, austere, calm, and sombre. This man, whose costume was hidden by the crowd that surrounded him, seemed to be not more than 35 years of age. Yet he was bald, having only a few thin tufts of hair about his temples, which were already grey. His broad and high forehead was beginning to be furrowed with wrinkles, but in his deep-set eyes there shone an extraordinary youth, an intense animation, a depth of passion. He kept them constantly fixed upon the gypsy, and while the giddy young girl of 16 danced and swung to the delight of all, his reveries seemed to grow more and more gloomy. From time to time a smile and a sigh met each other on his lips, but the smile was far more sad than the sigh. The girl, breathless, stopped at last, while the crowd lovingly applauded. "Jolly!" cried the gypsy. Gringoire then saw come up to her a little white goat, alert, brisk, and glossy, with gilt horns, gilt hoofs, and a gilt collar, which he had not before observed, because until that moment it had been lying crouched upon one corner of the carpet, looking at her mistress dance. "Jolly," said the dancer, "it's your turn now." And sitting down she gracefully held out her tambourine to the goat. "Jolly," she continued, "what month of the year is this?" The animal lifted its forefoot and struck one stroke upon the tambourine. It was, in fact, the first month of the year. The crowd applauded. "Jolly," resumed the girl, turning her tambourine another way, "what day of the month is it?" Jolly lifted her little golden foot and struck 6 times upon the tambourine. "Jolly," said the gypsy, with a new turn of the tambourine, "what hour of the day is it?" Jolly struck 7 strokes, and at that very moment the clock of the Maison aux Piliers rang 7. The people were wonderstruck. "There is witchcraft in all that," said a sinister voice in the crowd. It was that of the bald man who had his eyes constantly upon the gypsy. She shuddered and turned around, but the applause burst forth again and smothered the sinister exclamation. The attention of everyone was diverted at that moment by the procession of the Fool's Pope, which, after traversing many a street and square, was now pouring into the Place de Grève with all its torches and all its clamour. This procession had increased on the way, having listed all the ragamuffins, the unemployed thieves and idle scamps in Paris, so that when it reached the Grève it presented quite a respectable aspect. It is not easy to give an idea of the expression of proud and beatific joy which the melancholy and hideous visage of Quasimodo had attained in the journey. It was the first thrill of vanity that he had ever experienced. He had hitherto experienced nothing but humiliation, disdain at his condition, and disgust for his person. So, deaf as he was, he nevertheless relished, like a true pope, the acclamations of that crowd whom he had hated, because he felt himself hated by them. What though his people were a gathering of fools, of cripples, thieves, and beggars, still they were a people, and he was a sovereign. Around that dismal and unhappy countenance there was a perfect radiance. It was therefore not without surprise and alarm that all at once a man was seen to dart from the crowd, and with an angry gesture snatch from his hands the crozier of gilt wood, ensign of his mock papacy. The person who had this temerity was the man with the bald head, who, the moment before, was standing in the crowd that encircled the gypsy. He was in ecclesiastical dress. The moment he rushed forth from the crowd, he was recognized by Gringoire, who had not before observed him. "What?" said he with a cry of astonishment. "Why, it is my master, Don Claude Frollo, the Archdeacon. What the devil can he want with that one-eyed brute? He'll be devoured." A cry of terror proceeded from the multitude. The formidable Quasimodo had leaped down from his seat, and the women turned away their eyes that they might not see him tear the Archdeacon to pieces. He made one bound toward the priest, looked in his face, and then fell on his knees before him. The priest snatched his tiara from his head, broke his crozier, and rent his tinsel cope. Quasimodo remained upon his knees, bowed down his head, and clasped his hands. They then entered into a strange dialogue of signs and gestures, for neither of them uttered a word. The priest, erect, angry, threatening, imperious; Quasimodo, prostrate, humble, suppliant. And yet it is certain that Quasimodo could have crushed the priest with his thumb. At last the priest, roughly shaking Quasimodo's powerful shoulder, made him a sign to rise and follow. Quasimodo rose accordingly. Then the Brotherhood of Fools, their first amazement having passed, offered to defend their pope, thus abruptly dethroned. Quasimodo, placing himself before the priest, gave full play to the muscles of his athletic fists, and regarded the assailants, gnashing his teeth like an angry tiger. The priest resumed his sombre gravity, and making a sign to Quasimodo, withdrew in silence. Quasimodo walked before him, scattering the crowd in his passage. When they had made their way through the populace and across the place, the crowd of the curious and idle wished to follow them. Quasimodo then placed himself in the rear, and followed the Archdeacon backwards, looking squat, snarling, monstrous, shaggy, gathering up his limbs, licking his tusks, growling like a wild beast, and swaying backward the crowd by a mere glance or gesture. At length they both disappeared down a gloomy, narrow street into which no one dared to follow them. So effectually was its entrance barred by the mere image of Quasimodo gnashing his teeth. Gringoire had set himself to follow the gypsy girl. He had seen her with her goat turn down the Rue de la Contellerie, and accordingly he turned likewise. "Why not?" said he to himself. His step attracted the girl's attention. She several times turned her head towards him with uneasiness. Once indeed she stopped short, availed herself of a ray of light that escaped from a half-opened bakehouse to survey him steadily from head to foot. Then, after this scrutiny, Gringoire observed on her face a little grimace, and she went on without more ado. This little pout furnished Gringoire with a subject of reflection. There certainly was both disdain and mockery in their pretty grimace, and he was beginning to hang his head to count the paving stones, and to follow the girl at a rather greater distance. Then, at the turn of a street which for a moment hid her from view, he heard her utter a piercing shriek. He quickened his step. The street was filled with deep shadows, but Gringoire could discern the gypsy struggling in the arms of two men who were endeavouring to stifle her cries, while the poor little goat, in great alarm, put down her horns, bleating. "Hither! Hither! Gentlemen of the watch!" cried Gringoire, and he advanced bravely. One of the men who had laid hold of the girl turned toward him. It was the formidable visage of Quasimodo. Gringoire did not fly, but he did not advance another step. Quasimodo came up to him, and hurling him some 4 paces off upon the pavement with a backstroke of his hand, plunged rapidly into the darkness, bearing the girl, whose figure, drooping over his arm, was like a silken scarf. His companion followed him, and the poor goat ran behind with its plaintive bleat. "Murder! Murder!" cried the unfortunate gypsy. "Stand there, you scoundrels, and let go the wench!" was all at once heard in a voice of thunder from a horseman, who suddenly made his appearance from the neighbouring crossway. It was a captain of the king's archers, armed from head to foot with broadsword in hand. He snatched the gypsy from the grasp of the amazed Quasimodo, laid her across his saddle, and at the moment when the redoubtable hunchback, having recovered from his surprise, was rushing upon him to regain possession of his prey, 15 or 16 archers, who followed close upon their captain, made their appearance, each brandishing his 2-edged blade. Quasimodo was surrounded, seized, and garrotted. He roared, he foamed, he bit, and had it been daylight, no doubt his visage alone, rendered yet more hideous by rage, would have put the whole detachment to flight. But the darkness had disarmed him of his most formidable weapon, his ugliness. His companion had disappeared during the struggle. The gypsy gracefully gained her seat upon the officer's saddle, rested both her hands upon the young man's shoulders, and looked fixedly at him for a few seconds. "Monsieur the gendarme, what is your name?" "Captain Phoebus de Chateaupert, at your service, my fair one," said the officer, drawing himself up. "Thank you," said she. And while Captain Phoebus was curling his moustache, She glided down from the horse like an arrow falling to the ground, and fled. A flash of lightning could not have vanished more quickly. "By the Pope's head!" exclaimed the captain, while he tightened the bands upon Quasimodo. "I'd rather have kept the wench." 16 years previous to the period of this story, on a fine morning of the first Sunday after Easter, called in France Quasimodo Sunday, a living creature had been laid after Mass in the church of Notre Dame upon the wooden bed fastened into the pavement on the left hand, opposite to the great image of St. Christopher. Upon this bed it was customary to expose foundlings to public charity. Whoever cared to, took them. In front of the bed was a copper basin for alms. The sort of living creature which lay upon that board on Quasimodo Sunday morning, in the year of our Lord 1467, appeared to excite in a high degree the curiosity of a very considerable group of persons which had gathered around the bed. It consisted in great measure of individuals of the fair sex. They were nearly all old women. In the first row, and bending the farthest over the bed, were 4, who by their grey cagoule appeared to be attached to some religious community. "Whatever can that be, sister?" said Agnès de Gauchère, as she looked at the little exposed creature, which lay yelping and wriggling upon the wooden bed, frightened at being looked at by so many people. "What is to become of us?" returned Gauchère, "if that is the way children are made now?" "I am not learned in the matter of children," resumed Agnès, "but it must surely be a sin to look at such a one as this." "'Tis no child at all, Agnès. 'Tis a misshapen baboon," observed Gauchère. "I truly hope," resumed Agnès, "that nobody will offer to take him." For some moments a young priest had been listening to these arguments. His was a severe countenance, with a broad forehead and a penetrating eye. He silently put aside the crowd, scrutinized the child, and stretched out his hand over him. "I adopt this child," said the priest. He wrapped it in his cassock and bore it away. The bystanders looked after him with frightened glances. A moment later he disappeared through the red door which then led from the church to the cloister. When the first surprise was over, Agnès whispered in the ear of Gauchère, "I always said to you, sister, that young clerk, Monsieur Claude Frollo, was a sorcerer." Claude Frollo was in fact no common person. He had from infancy been destined by his parents for the ecclesiastical state. At 20 years of age, by special dispensation from the Holy See, he was ordained priest, and served as the youngest of the chaplains of Notre Dame at the altar called, on account of the late Mass that was said at it, the Altar of the Lazy. From the cloister his reputation for learning had spread to the people, among whom it had been in some degree changed, as not unfrequently happened in those days, into reputation for sorcery. It was when he was returning on the Quasimodo Sunday from saying his Mass of the Slothful at their altar, which was at the side of that gate of the choir which opened into the nave, on the right hand, near the image of the Virgin, that his attention had been aroused by the group of old women chattering around the bed for foundlings. Then it was that he had approached the unfortunate little creature, the object of so much hatred and menace. Its distress, its deformity, its abandonment, rushed into his heart at once. A deep feeling of pity had taken possession of him, and he had borne away the child. When he took the child from the bag, he found it to be very deformed indeed. The poor little imp had a great wart covering its left eye, the head compressed between the shoulders, the spine crooked, the breastbone prominent, and the legs bowed. Yet it seemed to be full of life, and although it was impossible to discover what language it babbled, its cry proclaimed a certain degree of health and strength. Claude's compassion was increased by this ugliness, and he vowed in his heart to bring up this child. He baptized his adopted child by the name of Quasimodo. whether it was that he chose thereby to mark the day upon which he'd found him, or that he meant to characterize by that name how incomplete and imperfect the poor little creature was. Indeed, Quasimodo, one-eyed, hump-backed, and knock-kneed, could hardly be considered anything more than a sketch. Now, in 1482, Quasimodo had grown up, and for several years had been ringer of the bells of Notre Dame, thanks to his foster father, Claude Frollo, who had become Archdeacon. With time, a certain bond of intimacy had been established, uniting the bell-ringer to the church. Separated forever from the world by the double fatality of his unknown birth and his deformity, imprisoned from his infancy within that double and impassable circle, the poor wretch had been accustomed to see nothing of the world beyond the religious walls which had received him under their shadow. Notre Dame had been to him by turns, as he grew and developed, egg, nest, home, country, universe. It was his own particular dwelling-place. It had no depths which Quasimodo had not penetrated, no heights which he had not scaled. Many a time had he clambered up its front, one story after another, with no other aid than the projecting bits of carving. The towers, over the exterior of which he was frequently seen crawling like a lizard, gliding upon an upright wall, those twin giants, so lofty, so threatening, so formidable, had for him neither vertigo, fright, nor sudden giddiness. So gentle did they appear under his hand, so easy to scale, one would have said that he had tamed them. By dint of leaping, climbing, sporting amid the abysses of the gigantic cathedral, he'd become something of both monkey and chamois. Moreover, not only his body but also his mind seemed to be moulded by the cathedral. In what state was that soul? What folds had it contracted? What form had it taken under that knotty covering in that wild and savage life? It would be difficult to determine. Quasimodo was born one-eyed, hump-backed, limping. It was with great difficulty and great patience that Claude Frollo had taught him to speak. But a fatality pursued the poor foundling. Bell-ringer of Notre Dame at 14 years of age, a fresh infirmity had come to complete his desolation. The sound of the bells had broken the drum of the ear. He had become deaf. The only door that nature had left wide open between him and the external world had been suddenly closed forever. In closing, it intercepted the sole ray of joy and light that still penetrated to the soul of Quasimodo. That soul was now wrapped in profound darkness. The poor creature's melancholy became as incurable and as complete as his deformity. Add to which his deafness rendered him in some sort dumb. For, that he might not be laughed at by others, from the moment that he realized his deafness, he determined resolutely to observe a silence which he scarcely ever broke, except when alone. He voluntarily tied up that tongue which Claude Frollo had worked so hard to set free, and hence it was that when necessity compelled him to speak, his tongue was heavy and awkward, like a door the hinges of which have grown rusty. From his very first intercourse with men, he had felt and then seen himself repulsed, branded, despised. Human speech had never been to him aught but mockery and curses. As he grew up, he had found around him nothing but hatred. What wonder that he should have caught it? He had contracted it. He had but picked up the weapon that had wounded him. The cathedral was not only his society, but his world. It was all nature to him. That which he loved above all in the paternal edifice, that which awakened his soul and made it stretch forth its poor pinions, that otherwise remained so miserably folded up in its cavern, that which even sometimes made him happy, was the bells. He loved them, caressed them, talked to them, understood them. From the chimes in the central steeple to the great bell over the doorway, they all shared his affections. The belfry of the transept and the two towers were to him three great cages, in which the birds sang for him alone. It was, however, those same bells that had deafened him, but a mother is often fondest of that child which has cost her the most suffering. It is true that their voices were the only ones he was still capable of hearing. On this account the great bell was his best beloved. She it was whom he preferred among this family of noisy sisters that fluttered about him on festival days. This great bell was named Marie. It is impossible to form a conception of his joy on the days of the great peals. The instant the Archdeacon let him off with the word "Go," he ascended the spiral staircase quicker than any other person could have gone down. He rushed, breathless, into the aerial chamber of the great bell, gazed at her for a moment attentively and lovingly, then began to talk to her softly, patted her with his hand, like a good horse setting out on a long journey. He pitied her for the labour she was about to undergo. After these first caresses, he called out to his assistants, placed in the lower story of the tower, to begin. The latter then hung their weight upon the ropes. The windlass creaked, and the enormous cone of metal moved slowly. Quasimodo, with heaving breast, followed it with his eye. The first stroke of the tongue against the brazen wall that encircled it shook the scaffolding upon which he stood. Quasimodo vibrated with the bell. "Rah!" he would cry, with a mad burst of laughter. Meanwhile the motion of the bell was accelerated, and as it went on, taking ever-increasing sweep, Quasimodo's eye, in like manner, opened more and more widely, phosphorescent and flaming. At length the grand peal began. The whole tower trembled. Rafters, leads, stones, all shook together, from the piles of the foundation to the trefoils of the parapet. Then Quasimodo boiled and frothed. He ran to and fro, trembling with the tower from head to foot. The bell, let loose and in a frenzy, turned first to one side and then to the other side of the tower, its brazen throat, from whence issued a roar that was audible at 4 leagues distance. Quasimodo placed himself before this gaping throat. He crouched down and rose with the oscillations of the bell, inhaled that furious breath, looked by turns down upon the place which was swarming with people 200 feet below him, and upon the enormous brazen tongue which came, second after second, to bellow in his ear. This was the only speech that he could hear, the only sound that broke for him the universal silence. He expanded in it like a bird in the sunshine. All at once the frenzy of the bell would seize him. His look became wild. He lay in wait for the great bell as a spider for a fly, and then flung himself headlong upon it. Now, suspended over the abyss, borne to and fro by the formidable swinging of the bell, he seized the brazen monster by the ears, gripped it with his knees, spurred it with his heels, and redoubled with the shock and weight of his body the fury of the peal. Meanwhile the tower trembled. He shouted and gnashed his teeth. His red hair bristled. His breast heaved and puffed like the bellows of a forge. His eye flashed fire. The monstrous bell neighed, panting beneath him. Then it was no longer either the great bell of Notre Dame nor Quasimodo. It was a dream, a whirl, a tempest, dizziness astride upon clamour, a strange centaur, half man, half bell, a spirit clinging to a winged monster, borne away upon a prodigious hippogriff of living bronze. There was only one human creature whom Quasimodo accepted from his malice and hatred for others, and whom he loved as much, perhaps more, than his cathedral. This was Claude Frollo. Quasimodo loved the Archdeacon as no dog, no horse, no elephant ever loved his master. In 1482, Quasimodo was about 20 years old, and Claude Frollo about 36. The one had grown up, the other had grown old, and the Archdeacon and the bell-ringer were but little esteemed among the small and great folks of the environs of the cathedral. A right enviable personage in the year of grace 1482 was the noble gentleman Robert d'Estouteville, knight, counsellor and chamberlain to the king and keeper of the provostry of Paris. Here, assuredly, was more than enough to make a life happy and illustrious, and to deserve some day a notable page in the history of Paris. And yet Monsieur Robert d'Estouteville had waked on the morning of the 7th of January 1482 in a very surly and peevish mood. It was the day after a holiday, a tiresome day for everyone, and above all for the magistrate whose business it was to sweep away all the filth, whether literally or figuratively, that a holiday accumulated in Paris. And then he was to hold a sitting in the Grand Châtelet. Now, we have noticed that judges in general contrive matters so that their day of sitting shall also be their day of ill humour, in order that they may always have someone upon whom to vent it conveniently in the name of the king and the law. However, the audience had begun without him. Maître Florian Barbedienne, auditor at the Châtelet, deputy of Monsieur the Provost, was acting for him. The room was small, low and vaulted. A table studded with fleur-de-lis stood at one end, with a large armchair of carved oak for the provost, which was empty, and on the left hand of it a stool for the auditor, Maître Florian. Below sat the registrar, scribbling. Opposite were the populace, and in front of the door and in front of the table were a number of sergeants of the provostry. Now, the auditor was deaf, a slight defect for an auditor. Maître Florian delivered judgment none the less, without appeal, and quite competently. It is certainly quite sufficient that a judge should appear to listen, and the venerable auditor the better fulfilled this condition, the only one essential to strict justice, as his attention could not possibly be distracted by any noise. Before the auditor stood the singular person of the hunchback. It was he indeed, bound, girded, roped, pinioned, and well guarded. The detachment of sergeants that surrounded him were accompanied by the knight of the watch in person. Quasimodo was gloomy, silent, and tranquil. Only now and then did his single eye cast a sly and wrathful glance upon the bonds which confined him. He cast the same glance about him, but it was so dull and sleepy that the women only pointed him out with their fingers in derision. Meanwhile, Maître Florian, the auditor, turned over attentively the document and the complaint entered against Quasimodo, which the clerk handed him, and having glanced at it, appeared to reflect for a moment before saying, "Your name?" Now, here was a case which had not been foreseen by the law, that of one deaf man interrogated by another. Quasimodo, receiving no intimation of the question thus addressed to him, continued to look fixedly at the judge, and made no reply. The deaf judge, receiving no intimation of the deafness of the accused, thought that he had answered, as accused persons generally did, and continued with his mechanical and stupid self-confidence, "Very well. Your age?" Again Quasimodo made no answer to this question. The judge, thinking it replied to, went on, "Now, your calling?" Still the same silence. The bystanders, however, were beginning to whisper and to exchange glances. "Enough!" added the imperturbable auditor, when he supposed that the accused had finished his third reply. "You are accused before us, firstly with nocturnal disturbance, secondly with dishonest violence upon the person of a foolish woman, thirdly of rebellion and disloyalty to all the archers of the guard of our lord the king. Explain yourself on all these points. Clerk, have you taken down what the prisoner has said thus far?" At this unlucky question a burst of laughter rose from both clerk and audience, so violent, so uncontrollable, so contagious, so universal, that neither of the deaf men could help perceiving it. Quasimodo turned round, shrugging his hump with disdain, while Maître Florian, seeing the shrug, cried, "For that answer, fellow, you deserve the halter. Know you to whom you speak?" This sally was not likely to check the explosion of the general mirth. Now, there is no reason why a deaf man talking to a deaf man should ever stop, Heaven knows where and when Maître Florian would have landed, thus launched at full speed in lofty eloquence, if the low door behind him had not suddenly opened and given entrance to Monsieur the Provost in person. Monsieur Robert de Stouteville frowned and made a gesture to Quasimodo to attend, in a manner so imperious and significant that the deaf one in some degree understood it. The Provost addressed him sternly. "What hast thou done to be brought hither, varlet?" The poor devil, supposing that the Provost was asking his name, broke the silence which he habitually kept, and in a harsh and guttural voice replied, "Quasimodo." The answer matched the question so little that the loud laugh began to circulate once more, and Monsieur Robert cried out, red with wrath, "Dost mock me too, thou arrant knave?" "Bell ringer of Notre Dame," answered Quasimodo, thinking himself called upon to explain to the judge who he was. "Bell ringer," returned the Provost, who, as we've already said, had got up that morning in so bad a humour that his fury needed not to be kindled by such unaccountable answers. "Bell ringer, indeed! I'll make them ring a peal of rods on thy back through every street in Paris. Dost thou hear, rascal?" "If you want to know my age," said Quasimodo, "I believe I shall be 20 next Martinmas." This was too much. The Provost could endure it no longer. "Ha! So you jeer at the Provostry, you wretch! Monsieur the Sergeant of the Wand, you'll take me this knave to the pillory in the grave, and now flog him and turn him for an hour. He shall pay for his impudence. Death!" The registrar presented the sentence to the Provost, who affixed his seal to it, and departed, to pursue his round of the several auditories. However, at the moment when Maître Florian Barbedienne was in his turn reading over the judgment before signing it, the registrar felt himself moved with pity for the poor condemned wretch, and in the hope of obtaining some mitigation of the penalty, he approached the auditor's ear as close as he could, and said, pointing to Quasimodo, "That man is deaf." Maître Florian replied, that is different. I did not know that. An hour more of the pillory in that case." And he signed the sentence thus modified. A crowd had gathered upon the Place de Grève around the pillory and the gibbet. This crowd were inspired with the hope of some sort of an execution. Not a hanging, probably, but a whipping, a cutting off of ears. Something, in short. At last the culprit arrived, tied to the tail of a cart, and as soon as he was hoisted upon the platform, so that he could be seen from all parts of the square, bound with cords and straps to the wheel of the pillory, a prodigious hooting, mingled with laughter and acclamations, burst from the assemblage in the square. They had recognized Quasimodo. It was he, in fact. It was a strange reverse, pilloried on the very place where the day before he had been saluted, acclaimed, and proclaimed Pope and Prince of Fools. The trumpeter to the king imposed silence on the louts and proclaimed the sentence, pursuant to the ordinance and command of Monsieur the Provost. They placed him on his knees on the circular plank. He made no resistance. He was stripped of shirt and doublet to the waist. He submitted. They bound him down under a system of straps and buckles. He let them buckle and strap him. Only from time to time he breathed heavily like a calf, whose head hangs dangling over the side of the butcher's cart. There was a wild laugh among the crowd when they saw, stripped naked to their view, Quasimodo's hump, his camel breast, his callous and hairy shoulders. At length the executioner stamped with his foot. The wheel began to turn. Quasimodo staggered under his bonds. The amazement suddenly depicted upon his deformed visage redoubled the bursts of laughter all around him. The thin lashes hissed sharply in the air like a handful of vipers, and fell with fury upon the poor wretch's shoulders. Quasimodo made a spring, as if starting from his sleep. He now began to understand. He writhed in his bonds. A violent contraction of surprise and pain distorted the muscles of his face, but he heaved not a sigh, only he turned his head backward to the right, then to the left, balancing it as a bull does when stung in the flank by a gadfly. A second stroke followed the first, then a third, then another, and another, and so on and on. The wheel did not cease to turn, nor the blows to rain down. Soon the blood spurted. It streamed in countless rivulets over the swarthy shoulders of the hunchback, and the slender thongs in their rotary motion which rent the air sprinkled drops of it upon the crowd. Quasimodo sank down, exhausted. Thenceforward he stirred no more. At length an usher of the Châtelet, clothed in black, mounted on a black horse, and stationed by the side of the steps from the commencement of the punishment, extended his ebony wand toward the hourglass. The executioner stopped, the wheel stopped, Quasimodo's eye slowly reopened. The flagellation was finished. Two assistants of the official torturer bathed the bleeding shoulders of the sufferer, anointed them with some kind of unguent, which immediately closed all the wounds, and threw over his back a sort of yellow cloth cut in the form of a chasuble. Quasimodo had still to undergo that hour on the pillory. The hourglass was therefore turned, and the hunchback was left bound to the plank, that justice might be fully satisfied. Here, as in the great hall, the women were most vehement. All bore him some grudge, some for his mischievousness, others for his ugliness. Countless insults rained upon him, and hootings, and imprecations, and laughter, and now and then a stone. Quasimodo was deaf, but his sight was good, and the public fury was not less forcibly expressed on their faces than by their words. Besides, the stones that struck him explained the bursts of laughter. He bore it for a time, but by degrees that patience which had resisted the lash of the torturer relaxed and gave way under these insect stings. However, that cloud was lightened for a moment as a mule passed through the crowd, bearing a priest on his back. As far away as he could see that mule and that priest, the poor sufferer's countenance softened. The fury which convulsed it gave way to a strange smile, full of ineffable sweetness, gentleness, tenderness. As the priest approached, this smile became more pronounced, more distinct, more radiant. It was as if the unfortunate creature hailed the arrival of a deliverer. But the moment the mule was near enough to the pillory for its rider to recognize the sufferer, the priest cast down his eyes, wheeled about, clapped spurs to his beast, as if in haste to escape a humiliating appeal, and by no means desirous of being known and addressed by a poor devil in such a situation. This priest was the Archdeacon Don Claude Frollo. Quasimodo's brow was overcast by a darker cloud than ever. The smile was still mingled with it for a time, but bitter, disheartened, and profoundly sad. Time passed. He had been there at least an hour and a half, lacerated, abused, mocked, and almost stoned to death. All at once he again struggled in his chains, with redoubled desperation that shook the whole framework that held him, and breaking the silence which he had hitherto obstinately kept, he cried in a hoarse and furious voice, which was more like a bark than a human cry, and which drowned the noise of the hooting, "Water!" This exclamation of distress, far from exciting compassion, heightened the mirth of the good people of Paris who surrounded the pillory. Not a voice was raised around the unhappy victim, except to jeer at his thirst. Certainly he was at this moment more grotesque and repulsive than he was pitiable, with his face purple and dripping, his wild eye, his mouth foaming with rage and suffering, and his tongue lolling half out. It must also be stated that had there even been any good, charitable soul of a townsman or townswoman among the rabble, who might have been tempted to carry a glass of water to that miserable creature in pain, so strong an idea of shame and ignominy was attached to the infamous steps of the pillory as would have sufficed to repel the good Samaritan. In a few minutes, Quasimodo cast a despairing look upon the crowd and repeated in a still more heart-rending voice, "Water!" Everyone laughed. "Water!" repeated Quasimodo for the third time, panting. At that moment he saw the populace make way. A young girl, fantastically dressed, emerged from the throng. She was followed by a little white goat with gilded horns, and carried a tambourine in her hand. Quasimodo's eyes sparkled. It was the gypsy girl, whom he had attempted to carry off the night before, for which piece of presumption he had some confused notion that they were punishing him at that very moment, which in point of fact was not in the least the case, since he was punished only for the misfortune of being deaf and of being tried by a deaf judge. He doubted not that she too was come to take her revenge, and to deal her blow like all the rest. Thus he beheld her rapidly ascend the steps. He was choking with rage and vexation. He would have liked to crumble the pillory to atoms, and could the flash of his eye have dealt death, the gypsy would have been reduced to ashes before she could have reached the platform. Without a word she approached the sufferer, who writhed in a vain effort to escape her, and, detaching a gourd from her girdle, she raised it gently to the poor wretch's parched lips. Then, in that eye, hitherto so dry and burning, a big tear was seen to start, which fell slowly down that misshapen face so long convulsed by despair. It was possibly the first that the unfortunate creature had ever shed. Meanwhile he forgot to drink. The gypsy girl made her little pout with impatience, and, smiling, pressed the neck of the gourd to the tusked mouth of Quasimodo. He drank deep draughts. His thirst was burning. When he had done, the poor wretch put out his black lips, undoubtedly to kiss the fair hand which had just succoured him. But the young girl, who, remembering the violent attempt of the preceding night, was perhaps not without some mistrust, drew back her hand with the frightened gesture of a child afraid of being bitten by some animal. Then the poor deaf creature fixed upon her a look of reproach and unutterable sorrow. It would have been a touching sight anywhere, this beautiful, fresh, pure, charming girl, who was at the same time so weak, thus piously hastening to the relief of so much wretchedness, deformity, and malevolence. On a pillory the spectacle was sublime. Esmeralda turned pale, and with faltering step descended from the pillory. The hour had come to release Quasimodo. He was unbound, and the crowd dispersed. Several weeks had passed. Opposite the lofty cathedral, reddened by the setting sun, upon a stone balcony, over the porch of a handsome Gothic house, some lovely young girls were laughing and chatting, gracefully and playfully. By the length of the veil which hung from the peak of their pointed coif, twined with pearls, down to their heels, they were noble and wealthy heiresses. They were, in fact, Damoiselle Fleur-de-Lis de Gondelaurier and her companions. The damsels in question had been entrusted by their parents to the care of the discreet and venerable Madame Aloise de Gondelaurier, widow of a former master of the king's crossbowmen, now living in retirement with her only daughter at her house in the Place du Parvis Notre Dame at Paris. The balcony on which these young girls were opened into an apartment richly hung with fawn-coloured Flanders leather, stamped with golden foliage. The beams that ran across the ceiling, diverting the eye with 1,000 fantastic carvings, were painted and gilded. At the farther end, by a high fireplace covered with armorial bearings and escutcheons from top to bottom, sat in a rich crimson velvet armchair the Lady of Gondelaurier, whose 55 years were as plainly written in her dress as on her face. By her side stood a young man of imposing, though somewhat vain and swaggering mien, one of those handsome fellows about whom all women agree. This young cavalier wore the brilliant uniform of a captain of the archers of the household troops. From the smiles and significant gestures of Madame Aloise, from the glances she threw toward her daughter Fleur-de-Lis, as she spoke low to the captain, it was evident that there was here a question of some betrothal concluded, some marriage near at hand, no doubt, between the young man and Fleur-de-Lis. One of the girls was peering over the balcony. "Oh, do look at that pretty dancing girl who is dancing on the pavement, and playing the tambourine among the people yonder." The sonorous vibration of a tambourine was, in fact, heard by the party. "Some gypsy girl from Bohemia," replied Fleur-de-Lis, turning nonchalantly toward the square. Let us see," cried her lively companions, running to the front of the balcony, while Fleur-de-Lis, musing over the coldness of her affianced lover, followed slowly. "Gentle cousin, did you not tell us of a little gypsy girl you saved from a parcel of thieves a month or more ago, as you were on the night patrol?" said Fleur-de-Lis. "I believe I did, fair cousin," said the captain. "Well," rejoined she, "perhaps it is that very gypsy girl who is now dancing in the parvis. Come and see if you recognize her, cousin Phoebus." Phoebus looked and said, "Yes, I know her by her goat." "Fair cousin Phoebus," said Fleur-de-Lis, "since you know this little gypsy girl, beckon to her to come up. It'll amuse us." "Oh, yes," exclaimed all the young girls, clapping their hands. "Why, it is not worth while," replied Phoebus. "She's no doubt forgotten me, and I know not even her name. However, since you wish it, ladies, I will try." And, leaning over the balustrade of the balcony, he began to call out, "Little one!" The dancing girl was not at that moment playing her tambourine. She turned her head toward the point whence this call proceeded. Her brilliant eyes rested on Phoebus, and she stopped short suddenly. "Little one!" repeated the captain, and he beckoned to her to come in. A moment or two after, the tapestry door hanging was raised, and the gypsy appeared on the threshold of the room, blushing, confused, breathless, her large eyes cast down, and not daring to advance a step farther. The gypsy's reception proved mightily freezing. The girls eyed her from head to foot, then exchanged glances, and all was said. They understood each other. "My pretty girl," said Phoebus, with emphasis, taking several steps towards her, "I do not know whether I have the supreme felicity of being recognized by you." She interrupted him with a look and smile of infinite sweetness. "Oh, yes," said she. "She has a good memory," observed Fleur-de-Lis. "Well, now," resumed Phoebus, "you escaped nimbly the other evening. Did I frighten you?" "Oh, no," said the gypsy. There was, in the intonation of that "oh, no," uttered after that "oh, yes," an ineffable something which wounded Fleur-de-Lis. "You left me in your stead, my beauty," continued the captain, "a rare grim-faced fellow, hump-backed and one-eyed, the ringer of the bishop's bells, I believe. What the deuce can that screech-owl want with you? Eh? Tell me." "I do not know," she replied. The old dame, who was watching this scene, felt offended, without understanding why. "Holy Virgin!" cried she suddenly. "What's that about my legs? The villainous beast!" It was the goat, which had just arrived in search of its mistress, and which, in hurrying toward her, had entangled its horns in the load of drapery which the noble dame's garments heaped around her when she was seated. This made a diversion. The gypsy disentangled its horns without saying a word. At that moment, Fleur-de-Lis noticed a little bag of embroidered leather hung round the goat's neck. "What is that?" she asked of the gypsy. The girl raised her large eyes toward her and replied gravely, "That is my secret." "I should like to know your secret," thought Fleur-de-Lis. Meanwhile the good dame had risen angrily. Come, you gypsy, if neither you nor your goat have anything to dance to us, what are you doing here?" The gypsy directed her steps slowly toward the door without making any reply, but the nearer she approached it, the slower were her steps. An irresistible magnet seemed to retard her. Suddenly she turned her eyes, moistened with tears, toward Phoebus, and stood still. "Zoons!" cried the captain, "you shall not go away thus. Come back and dance for us something. By the by, what's your name?" "Esmeralda," said the dancer, without taking her eyes off him. Meanwhile, another of the girls, without attracting attention, had, a few minutes before, enticed the goat into a corner of the room with a piece of nut cake. In an instant they had become good friends, and the curious girl had untied the little bag which hung at the goat's neck, had opened it, and spread the contents on the matting. It was an alphabet, each letter being inscribed separately on a small tablet of wood. No sooner were these toys displayed upon the matting than the goat selected with her gilded hoof certain letters, and arranged them in a particular order by gently pushing them together. "Fleur-de-lis! Do you see what the goat has been doing?" cried the girl. Fleur-de-lis hastened to look, and suddenly started. The letters arranged on the floor formed this word, Phoebus, Phoebus. They all hurried forward to look, the mother, the young ladies, the gypsy, and the officer. The gypsy saw the blunder the goat had committed. She turned red, then pale, and began to tremble like a culprit before the captain, who regarded her with a smile of satisfaction and astonishment. "Phoebus," whispered the girls in amazement. "That's the captain's name." "You have a wonderful memory," said Fleur-de-lis to the stupefied gypsy. Then, bursting into sobs, "Oh," stammered she tearfully, hiding her face between her two fair hands, "she's a sorceress," while she heard a voice yet more bitter whisper from her inmost heart, "She is a rival." She fell fainting to the floor. "My child, my child!" cried the terrified mother. "Begone, you fiendish gypsy!" Esmeralda gathered together the unlucky letters in the twinkling of an eye, made a sign to Djali, and quitted the room at one door as Fleur-de-lis was being carried out through the other. Captain Phoebus, left alone, hesitated a moment between the two doors, then followed the gypsy. Every day, an hour before sunset, the Archdeacon ascended the staircase of the tower and shut himself up in his cell, where he sometimes passed whole nights. On this day, just as he had reached the low door of his retreat and was putting into the lock the complicated little key, which he always carried with him in the purse suspended at his side, the sound of a tambourine and castanets reached his ear. This sound proceeded from the square in front of the cathedral. Claude Frollo had hastily withdrawn the key, and in an instant was on the summit of the tower, in gloomy, thoughtful attitude. There he stood, grave, motionless, absorbed in one sight, one thought. All Paris lay at his feet, with her 1,000 spires and her circular horizon of gently rolling hills, with her river winding under her bridges and her people flowing to and fro through her streets. But in all the city the Archdeacon saw but one spot on its pavement, the Place du Parvis. In all that crowd but one figure, that of the gypsy. It would have been difficult to say what was the nature of that glance, or whence arose the flame that issued from it. It was a fixed gaze, but full of tumult and perturbation. Since his morning on the pillory, the inhabitants in the neighbourhood of Notre Dame thought they noticed that Quasimodo's bell-ringing ardour had grown cool. Formerly the bells were going on all occasions. The old church, vibrating and sonorous, was in a perpetual joyous whirl of bells. Some spirit of noise and caprice seemed to sing continuously through those mouths of brass. Now that spirit seemed to have departed. The cathedral seemed gloomy and wilfully silent. This same morning, having reached the high loft of the belfry, Quasimodo gazed for some time, with a sorrowful shake of the head, on his 6 songstresses, as if lamenting that some other object had intruded into his heart between them and him. Letting his glance fall between the large slate scales which cover at a certain height the perpendicular wall of the belfry, he descried on the square a young girl, fantastically dressed, who stopped, spread out on the ground a carpet, on which a little goat came and placed itself, and around whom a group of spectators made a circle. He turned his back to the bells and crouched behind the slate eaves, fixing on the dancer a thoughtful, tender, and softened look. The next day, Claude Frollo happened to be crossing the square when he overheard a conversation which inflamed his seemingly cool priest's blood. He perceived an officer of the guard talking with another, when the sound of a tambourine reached them from a neighbouring crossway. Don Claude heard the officer say, "Thunder, let's hasten our steps." "Why?" Phoebus asked the other. "I'm afraid lest the gypsy will see me." "What gypsy?" "The little one with the goat." "La Esmeralda?" "The same. Let us make haste. She'll recognize me, and I would not wish that girl to accost me in the streets." "Are you then acquainted with her, Phoebus?" Here the Archdeacon saw Phoebus chuckle, stoop to his companion's ear, and whisper a few words in it. Phoebus then burst into a laugh and tossed his head with a triumphant air. "For a truth?" "On my soul," said Phoebus. "This evening?" "This evening." "Are you sure she will come?" "Are you a fool? Can there ever be any doubt in such matters?" "Captain Phoebus, you're a lucky soldier." The Archdeacon overheard all this conversation. His teeth chattered. A visible shiver ran through his whole body. He stopped a moment, leaned against a post like a drunken man, then followed in the track of the two jolly scamps. When he came up with them again, they'd changed the subject, and he heard them singing at the top of their lungs the refrain, "The lads the dice who merrily throw, merrily to the gallows go." Night was falling. The street was dark. The wine-shop, full of candles, flamed from afar like a forge in the darkness. The noise of glasses and feasting, of oaths and quarrels, could be heard through the broken panes. One man, however, paced imperturbably back and forth in front of the noisy tavern, looking at it incessantly, and going no farther from it than a pikeman from his sentry-box. He was cloaked up to the nose. At length the tavern door opened. It was for this that he seemed to have been waiting. Two tipplers came out. "Thunder and guns," said one of the two drinkers. "'Tis on the stroke of 7, the hour of my appointed meeting." And leaving his companion, he went his way. On turning into the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, Captain Phoebus perceived that someone was following him. As he accidentally glanced behind him, he saw a sort of shadow creeping behind him along the walls. He stopped. It stopped. He went on. The shadow went on again also. The captain was brave and would have cared little for a robber with a rapier in his hand. But this walking statue, this petrified man, made his blood run cold. At that time there were certain strange rumours afloat about a spectre monk, a nocturnal prowler about the streets of Paris in the night time, and they now came confusedly to his mind. He stood stupefied for a few moments, then finally broke silence with a laugh. "Sir," said he, "if you be a thief, as I hope is the case, you're just now for all the world like a heron attacking a walnut shell. My dear fellow, I'm the son of a ruined family. If you must thieve, you'll find in the chapel of this college some wood of the true cross set in silver." The hand of the shadow came forth from under its cloak and descended upon the arm of Phoebus with the force of an eagle's grip. At the same time the shadow spoke. "Captain Phoebus de Chateaupert." "What the devil," said Phoebus, "you know my name?" "I know not your name alone," returned the man in the cloak with his sepulchral voice, "but I know that you have an appointment this evening." "Yes," answered Phoebus in amazement. "At 7 o'clock. In a quarter of an hour." "At the Falourdels." "Exactly so." "The old hag of the Pont Saint-Michel." "Of Saint-Michel, the archangel, as the Paternoster saith." "Impious man," muttered the spectre. "With a woman?" "I confess." "Whose name is La Esmeralda," said Phoebus gaily, all his heedlessness having gradually returned to him. At this name the shadow's grasp shook Phoebus' arm furiously. "Captain Phoebus de Chateaupert, thou liest!" "Christ and Satan!" cried the captain. "That's a word that seldom assails the ear of a Chateaupert. Thou darest not repeat it." "Thou liest," said the shadow coldly. The captain ground his teeth. Spectre, monk, phantom, superstitions, all were forgotten at that moment. He now saw nothing but a man and an insult. "It is well," spluttered he in a voice choking with rage. He drew his sword, then, stuttering, for anger as well as fear makes a man tremble, "Here," said he, "on the spot, come on! Swords, swords! Blood upon these stones!" But the other did not stir. When he saw his adversary on guard and ready to lunge, "Captain Phoebus," said he, and his voice quivered with bitterness, "you forget your assignation." The fits of rage of such men as Phoebus are like boiling milk, whose ebullition is calmed by a drop of cold water. These few words brought down the point of the sword which glittered in the captain's hand. "Captain," continued the man, "tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, a month hence, 10 years hence, you will find me quite ready to cut your throat. But first, go to your assignation." "In sooth," said Phoebus, as if seeking to capitulate with himself, "a sword and a girl are two delightful things to encounter at a trysting place, but I cannot see why I should miss one of them for the sake of the other, when I may have both." He replaced his sword in his scabbard. "Go to your assignation," resumed the unknown. "Sir," answered Phoebus, with some embarrassment, "gramercy for your courtesy." Here Phoebus scratched his ear. "By my halidom, I forgot. I haven't a penny to pay the price of a garret, and the old hag will want to be paid beforehand. She distrusts me." "Here is the wherewithal to pay." Phoebus felt the stranger's cold hand slip into his a large coin. He could not help taking the money and grasping the hand. "God's truth!" he exclaimed, "but you're a good fellow." "One condition," said the man. "Prove to me that I was wrong and that you spoke the truth. Hide me in some corner whence I may see whether this woman be really she whose name you uttered." "Oh, replied Phoebus, "'tis all one to me. We will take the St. Martha chamber. You can see at your ease from the kennel hard by." "Come then," rejoined the shadow. "At your service," said the captain. "I know not indeed whether you be not Messer Diabolus in person, but let us be good friends tonight. Tomorrow I'll pay you all debts, of purse and of sword." They set out again at a rapid pace. In a few minutes the sound of the river below apprised them that they were upon the bridge of Saint-Michel, then covered with houses. Phoebus stopped before a low door and knocked loudly. A light appeared through the cracks of the door. "Who is there?" cried a mumbling voice. "By the body, by the belly, by the head of God," answered the captain. The door opened instantly, and revealed to the newcomers an old woman and an old lamp, both of which trembled. The old woman was bent double, dressed in rags, with a shaking head pierced by 2 small eyes, and coiffed with a dishclout, wrinkled everywhere, on hands and face and neck, her lips receding under her gums, and all round her mouth she had tufts of white hair, which gave her the whiskered and demure look of a cat. The interior of the hovel was no less dilapidated than herself. The walls were of plaster, black rafters ran across the ceiling, a dismantled fireplace, cobwebs in every corner. In the middle of the room a tottering company of maimed stools and tables. A dirty child played in the ash-heap, and at the farther end a staircase, or rather a wooden ladder, led to a trapdoor in the ceiling. As he entered this den, Phoebus' mysterious companion drew his cloak up to his eyes. Meanwhile the captain, swearing like a Turk, hastened to offer the crown piece. "The St. Martha room," said he. The old woman addressed him as Monseigneur, and deposited the crown in a drawer. It was the coin which the man in the black cloak had given Phoebus. While her back was turned, the ragged, dishevelled little boy, who was playing in the ashes, went slyly to the drawer, abstracted the crown piece, and put in its place a dry leaf which he had plucked from a faggot. The hag beckoned to the two gentlemen, as she called them, to follow her. On reaching the upper story, she placed her lamp upon a chest, and Phoebus, like a frequenter of the house, opened the door of a dark closet. "Go in there, my dear fellow," said he to his companion. The man in the cloak complied without uttering a word. The door closed upon him, he heard Phoebus bolt it, and a moment afterward go downstairs again with the old woman. The light had disappeared. Claude Frollo groped about for some moments in the dark hole into which the captain had bolted him. His head was burning. What was passing at that moment in the dark soul of the Archdeacon? God and himself alone could tell. He had been waiting a quarter of an hour. It seemed to him that he had grown a century older. All at once he heard the wooden staircase creak. Someone was coming up. Light reappeared. In the worm-eaten door of his nook there was a crack of considerable width. To this he glued his face. The cat-faced old woman appeared first with lamp in hand, then Phoebus twirling his moustache, then a third person, that lovely, graceful creature, La Esmeralda. The priest beheld her rise from below like a dazzling apparition. Claude trembled. A cloud spread over his eyes. His pulse beat violently. Everything swam before him. He no longer saw or heard anything. When he came to himself again, Phoebus and Esmeralda were alone, seated on the wooden chest beside the lamp, whose light revealed to the Archdeacon's eyes their two youthful figures, and a miserable pallet at the farther end of the garret. Beside the pallet was a window, broken, through the panes of which, like a cobweb upon which rain has fallen, could be seen a small patch of sky, with the moon in the distance resting on a pillow of soft clouds. The young girl was blushing, confused, palpitating. Her long drooping lashes shaded her glowing cheeks. The face of the officer, to which she dared not lift her eyes, was radiant. Mechanically, and with a charming air of embarrassment, she traced with the tip of her finger meaningless lines upon the bench, and watched her finger. Her feet were not visible, for the little goat was nestling upon them. The captain was gallantly arrayed. At his neck and wrists he had tufts of embroidery, the great elegance of the day. Dom Claude could only hear with great difficulty what they said to each other, through the humming of the blood that was boiling in his temples. Esmeralda remained silent for a moment. Then a tear fell from her eye, a sigh from her lips, and she said, "Oh, Monseigneur, I love you." Phoebus threw his arm around the gypsy's waist. He had only been waiting for this opportunity. The priest saw him, and tested with the tip of his finger the point of a dagger concealed in his breast. "Phoebus," continued the Bohemian, gently disengaging her waist from the tenacious hands of the captain, "you are good, you are generous, you are handsome. You have saved me, who am but a poor gypsy foundling." The captain gently unbuckled the gypsy's girdle. "What are you doing?" she said quickly. "Nothing," answered Phoebus. "I was only saying that you must abandon all this garb of folly and street-running when you're with me." "When I am with thee, my Phoebus," said the young girl tenderly. She again became pensive and silent. The young girl let Phoebus have his way. She seemed unconscious of what he was doing. The bold captain's eyes sparkled. All at once she turned towards him. "Phoebus," said she, with an expression of infinite love, "instruct me in thy religion." "My religion!" cried the captain, bursting into a laugh. "I instruct you in my religion? "Blood and thunder! What do you want with my religion?" "That we may be married," she replied. The captain's face assumed a mingled expression of surprise, disdain, carelessness, and licentious passion. "Bah," said he, "why should one marry?" The gypsy turned pale, and her head drooped sadly on her breast. Dom Claude saw all from his hiding-place. Suddenly, with a rapid motion, Phoebus snatched off the gypsy's neckerchief. The poor girl, who had remained pale and dreamy, started up as if suddenly awakened. She hastily drew back from the enterprising officer, and casting a glance at her bare neck and shoulders, blushing, confused, and mute with shame, she crossed her 2 lovely arms upon her bosom to hide it. "Have pity, Captain Phoebus. Give me back my neckerchief." Phoebus drew back and said coldly, "Oh, young lady, I see plainly that you do not love me." "Not love him!" exclaimed the unhappy child, and at the same time clinging to the captain and drawing him to a seat by her side. "Not love thee, my Phoebus! What art thou saying, wicked man, to rend my heart? Oh, come, take me, take all, do with me as thou wilt, I am thine. Phoebus, I will be thy mistress, thy amusement, thy pleasure, when thou wilt, a girl who will be only thine. I was only made for that, soiled, despised, dishonoured. But what then? Loved. I shall be the proudest and the happiest of women." So saying, she threw her arms around the officer's neck. She looked up at him imploringly and smiled through her tears. Her delicate neck rubbed against his cloth doublet with its rough embroidery. She twisted her beautiful half-naked limbs around his knees. The intoxicated captain pressed his burning lips to those lovely shoulders. The young girl, her eyes cast upward to the ceiling, her head thrown back, quivered, all palpitating beneath this kiss. All at once, above the head of Phoebus, she beheld another head, a green, livid, convulsed face, with the look of a lost soul. Beside this face there was a hand which held a dagger. It was the face and hand of the priest. He had broken open the door, and he was there. Phoebus could not see him. The young girl was motionless, frozen mute at the frightful apparition, like a dove which chances to raise its head at the instant when the hawk is glaring into her nest with his round eyes. She could not even utter a cry. She saw the poniard descend upon Phoebus and rise again reeking. "Malediction!" said the captain, and he fell. She fainted. As her eyes closed, as all consciousness left her, she thought she felt a fiery touch upon her lips, a kiss more burning than the executioner's branding iron. When she recovered her senses, she was surrounded by soldiers of the watch. They were carrying off the captain, weltering in his blood. The priest had disappeared. The window at the back of the room, looking upon the river, was wide open. They picked up a cloak which they supposed to belong to the officer, and she heard them saying around her, "'Tis a sorceress who has stabbed the captain." There was a crowd at one of the doors of the Palace of Justice. Inside, an old woman was giving her testimony.
"All at once, I hear a cry overhead, and something falls on the floor, and the window opens. I run to mine, which is beneath it, and I see a dark mass drop past my eyes into the water. It was a phantom, clad like a priest. The moon was shining. I saw it quite plainly. Then, all of a tremble, I call the watch. We go upstairs, and what do we find? My poor chamber, all blood. The captain stretched out at full length with a dagger in his neck, the girl pretending to be dead, and the goat all in a fright. They carry off the officer and the girl, all in disorder. But wait. The worst is that on the next day, when I went to get the crown, I found a withered leaf in its place."
The old woman ceased. A murmur of horror ran through the audience. "That phantom, that goat, all that smacks of sorcery," they were saying to one another. Esmeralda was pale. Her hair, once so gracefully plaited and spangled with sequins, hung in disorder. Her lips were livid, her hollow eyes were terrible. Alas!
"Phoebus," said she wildly, "where is he? Oh, messeigneur, before you kill me, tell me, for pity's sake, whether he yet lives."
"Be silent, woman," answered the president. "That is no concern of ours."
"Oh, have mercy, tell me if he's alive," continued she, clasping her beautiful emaciated hands, and her chains were heard as they brushed along her dress.
"Well," said the king's advocate roughly, "he is dying. Does that content you?"
The wretched girl fell back on her seat, speechless, tearless, white as a wax figure. In order to arouse her, a sergeant was obliged to shake her unmercifully, while the president solemnly raised his voice.
"Girl, you are of Bohemian race, addicted to deeds of witchcraft. You, in complicity with the bewitched goat implicated in the charge, did on the night of the 29th of March last wound, in concert with the powers of darkness, by the aid of charms and spells, a captain of the king's archers, Phoebus de Chateaupert by name."
"Horrible!" exclaimed the young girl, hiding her face with her hands. "My Phoebus! Oh, this is indeed hell!"
"Bohemian girl," continued the president, "do you confess all your acts of sorcery, prostitution, and assassination upon Phoebus de Chateaupert?" Her heart was wrung. She was heard sobbing amid the darkness.
"Whatever you will," answered she feebly, "but kill me quickly."
The clerk of the court began to write. Then he handed the president a long scroll of parchment. The unhappy girl then heard a stir among the people, the pikes clash, and a chilling voice say, "Bohemian girl, on such a day as it shall please our lord the king, at the hour of noon, you shall be taken in a tumbrel, in your shift, barefoot, with a rope around your neck, before the great portal of Notre Dame, and there you shall do penance with a wax torch of 2 pounds weight in your hand, and from thence you shall be taken to the Place de Grève, where you shall be hanged and strangled on the town gibbet, and likewise this your goat, so God have mercy on your soul."
"Oh, 'tis a dream," murmured she,
and she felt rough hands bearing her away. Beneath the fortress of Saint-Antoine, at the Palace of Justice of Paris, at the Louvre, were subterranean prisons. The stories of these prisons, as they went deeper into the ground, grew narrower and darker. They formed so many zones, presenting various degrees of horror. Dante could never have imagined anything better for his hell. It was in a dungeon hole of this kind that Esmeralda had been placed when condemned to the gibbet. How long had she been there? She knew not. At length, one day or one night, she heard above her a louder noise than that usually made by the turnkey when he brought her bread and jug of water. The heavy lock creaked, and she beheld a lantern. The light pained her so acutely that she shut her eyes. When she reopened them, the door was closed, the lantern was placed on a step of the staircase. One man alone was standing before her. A black gown fell to his feet. A cowl of the same hue concealed his face.
"Who are you?"
A priest. The word, the accent, the sound of the voice made her start. The priest continued in a hollow tone, "Are you prepared?"
"For what?"
"To die."
"Oh," said she, "will it be soon?"
"Tomorrow." Her head, which she had raised with a look of joy, again sank upon her bosom.
"That's very long yet," murmured she.
What difference would a day make to them? "Are you then very unhappy?" asked the priest after a short silence.
"I am very cold," replied she.
She took her feet in her hands, and her teeth chattered. The priest's eyes appeared to be wandering from under his hood around the dungeon. Without light, without fire, in the water, it is horrible. Yes, answered she, with the bewildered air which misery had given her. The day belongs to everyone. Why do they give me only night? Do you know, resumed the priest after another silence, why you are here? I think I knew once, said she, passing her thin fingers across her brow, as if to assist her memory, but I know no longer. All at once she began to weep like a child. I want to go away from here, monsieur. I am cold, I am afraid, and there are creatures here that crawl over my body. Well, follow me. So saying, the priest took her arm. The poor girl was chilled to her very vitals, yet that hand felt cold to her. Oh, murmured she, 'tis the icy hand of death. Who are you? The priest threw back his hood. She looked. It was at that sinister visage which she last saw glaring beside a dagger. Do you look on me with horror? He asked. Her lips contracted as if she was smiling. Yes, said she. The executioner taunts the condemned. For months he pursues me, threatens me, terrifies me. But for him, my God, how happy I would be. It is he who has cast me into the abyss. Oh, heavens, it was he who killed, it was he who killed him, my Phoebus. Here she burst into sobs, and raising her eyes toward the priest, Oh, wretch, who are you? What have I done to you? Do you then hate me so? Alas, what have you against me? I love thee, cried the priest. Her tears suddenly ceased. She eyed him with the vacant stare of an idiot. He had fallen on his knees and was devouring her with eyes of flame. Dost thou hear? I love thee, cried he again. Both remained silent for several minutes, crushed under the weight of their emotions. He maddened, she stupefied. Listen, said the priest at last, and a strange calm came over him. Thou shalt know all. One day I was leaning on the window of my cell. What book was I reading? Oh, all that is whirling now in my brain. I was reading. The window opened upon a square. I heard the sound of a tambourine and music. Vexed at being thus disturbed in my reverie, I glanced into the square. What I saw, others saw beside myself. And yet it was not a spectacle for mortal eye. There, in the middle of the pavement, it was noon, brilliant sunshine. A creature was dancing. A creature so beautiful that God would have preferred her to the Virgin. Alas, young girl, it was thou. Surprised, intoxicated, charmed, I allowed myself to gaze upon thee. I looked at thee so long that suddenly I shuddered with affright. I felt that the hand of fate was upon me. The priest, oppressed by emotion, paused for a moment, then continued, I saw thee again. Misery! When I had seen thee twice, I wished to see thee 1,000 times. I wished to see thee always. Then how stop short on that steep descent to hell? Then I was no longer my own master. I spied thee out at the corners of streets. I watched thee from the top of my tower. Each night I found myself more charmed, more despairing, more fascinated, more lost. I had learned who thou wast, a gypsy, a bohemian. First I tried to have thee forbidden the square in front of Notre Dame, hoping to forget thee if thou camest no more. Thou didst not heed, thou camest again. Then came the idea of carrying thee off. One night I attempted it. There were 2 of us. Already we had laid hold on thee when that wretched officer came upon us. he delivered thee. Thus was he the beginning of thy misfortunes, of mine and of his own. One day, again the sun was shining brightly, I beheld a man pass me who pronounced thy name and laughed, and who carried profligacy in his eyes. Damnation! I followed him. Thou knowest the rest." He ceased. The young girl could find but one word. "Oh, my Phoebus." "Not that name," said the priest, seizing her arm with violence. "Pronounce not that name. Oh, I love thee. I am a miserable wretch when thou utterest that name, unhappy girl. It's as if thou wert grinding between thy teeth every fibre of my heart. Mercy! If thou comest from hell, I go thither with thee. I have done everything to that end. The hell where thou art will be my paradise. The sight of thee is more entrancing than that of God. We would love each other. We would pour our two souls one into the other, and we would each have an inextinguishable thirst for the other, which we would quench incessantly and together at the inexhaustible fountain of love." She interrupted him with a loud and terrible laugh. He seized her arm. He was frantic. He strove to drag her away. She fixed her eye intently on him. "What has become of my Phoebus?" "Ah!" said the priest, letting go her arm. "You have no pity?" "What has become of Phoebus?" she repeated coldly. "He is dead!" cried the priest. "Dead?" said she, still cold and passionless. "Then why do you talk to me of living?" He heard her not. "Oh, yes," said he, as if talking to himself. "He must indeed be dead. The blade entered deep. I believe I touched his heart with the point. Oh, my very soul was in that dagger's point." The young girl rushed upon him like an enraged tigress, and thrust him against the flight of steps with supernatural strength. "Begone, monster! Begone, murderer! Leave me to die! May the blood of us both mark thy brow with an everlasting stain! Be thine priest never, never! Nothing shall unite us, not hell itself! Begone, accursed, never!" The priest had stumbled to the steps. He silently disengaged his feet from the folds of his cassock, took up his lantern, and began slowly to ascend the steps leading to the door. He reopened the door and went out. All at once the young girl beheld his head reappear. His face wore a frightful expression, and he cried to her, hoarse with rage and despair, "I tell thee, he is dead!" She fell face downwards on the ground, and no sound was heard in the dungeon save the sob of a drop of water, which made the pool palpitate amid the darkness. Phoebus, however, was not dead. Men of that stamp are hard to kill. Not that Phoebus' wound was not severe, but it was less so than the Archdeacon flattered himself. This, however, had not in the least affected the judicial proceedings. Justice in those days cared little about clearness and precision in the proceedings against a criminal. Provided only that the accused was hanged, that was all that was necessary. Now the judges had ample proof against La Esmeralda. They believed Phoebus to be dead, and that was the end of the matter. Phoebus, for his part, had simply rejoined his company in garrison a few stages from Paris. Fleur-de-lis was his last flame but one, a pretty girl, a delightful dowry. Accordingly, one fine morning, quite cured, and fairly presuming that after 2 months had elapsed the affair of the gypsy girl must be over and forgotten, the amorous cavalier arrived on a prancing horse at the door of the Gondelaurier mansion. Phoebus, who had seen nothing in the line of beauty since he quitted the country wenches, was intoxicated with the sight of Fleur-de-lis, which imparted to our officer so eager and gallant an air that his peace was made immediately. Madame de Gondelaurier herself, still maternally seated in her big armchair, had not the courage to scold him. As for Fleur-de-lis's reproaches, they died away in tender cooings. Turning the conversation, he said, "What noise is that in the square?" He went to the window. "Oh, heavens, fair cousin, what a great crowd in the place!" "I do not know," said Fleur-de-Lis. "It appears that a witch is to do penance this morning before the church, and thereafter to be hanged." So absolutely did the captain believe the affair of La Esmeralda to be terminated, that he was little affected by these words of Fleur-de-Lis. Nevertheless, he asked her one or two questions. "What's the name of this witch?" "I do not know," she replied. "And what is she said to have done?" She again shrugged her white shoulders. "I know not." The Place du Parvis Notre Dame, upon which, as we know, the balcony looked, presented at that moment a singular and sinister spectacle. An immense crowd, which overflowed into all the neighbouring streets, blocked up the square itself. The surface of this mob was grey, dirty, and squalid. The spectacle which it was awaiting was evidently one of those which have the privilege of extracting and collecting all that is most unclean in the population. The clock of Notre Dame slowly struck 12. A murmur of satisfaction burst from the crowd. The last vibration of the 12th stroke had hardly died away, when all the heads surged like the waves before a sudden gale, and an immense shout went up from the pavement, from the windows, and from the roofs. "There she is!" Fleur-de-Lis covered her eyes with her hands that she might not see. "My charmer," said Phoebus, "will you go in?" "No," replied she, and those eyes which she had just closed through fear, she opened again through curiosity. A tumbrel, drawn by a strong Norman dray horse, and quite surrounded by horsemen in violet livery with white crosses, had just entered the square. In the fatal cart sat a young girl, her hands tied behind her, and with no priest at her side. She was in her shift. Her long black hair, the custom then was to cut it only at the foot of the gibbet, fell in disorder upon her half-bared throat and shoulders. Athwart that waving hair, more glossy than a raven's plumage, a rough grey cord was seen, twisted and knotted, chafing her delicate skin and winding about the poor girl's graceful neck like an earthworm around a flower. Beneath that rope glittered a small amulet, ornamented with bits of green glass, which had been left to her, no doubt, because nothing is refused to those about to die. The spectators at the windows could see in the bottom of the tumbrel her naked legs, which she strove to conceal under her as by a final feminine instinct. At her feet lay a little goat, bound. "Jesus," said Fleur-de-Lis hastily to the captain, "look there, fair cousin. It's that horrid gypsy girl with the goat." So saying, she turned to Phoebus. His eyes were fixed on the tumbrel. He was very pale. It was but too truly La Esmeralda. In this last stage of ignominy and misfortune, she was still beautiful. The tumbrel entered the Parvis. Before the central doorway of the church it stopped. The escort drew up in line on either side. The mob was silenced. And amid this silence, so solemn and anxious, the two halves of the great door turned, as if of themselves, upon their hinges, which creaked like the sound of a fife. They untied her hands, made her alight, accompanied by her goat, which was also unbound, and which bleated with joy at finding itself free. She was then led barefoot over the hard pavement to the foot of the steps leading to the portal. The cord about her neck trailed behind her like a serpent pursuing her. Then the chanting in the church ceased. A great golden cross and a row of wax candles began to move through the gloom. "Oh," she said in a low tone with a shudder, "'tis he again, the priest." It was, in fact, the Archdeacon. On his left walked the sub-chanter, and on his right the precentor, carrying his staff of office. He advanced with head thrown back, eyes fixed and opened wide, chanting in a loud voice, "Young woman, have you asked pardon of God for your sins and your offences?" He bent to her ear and added, the spectators supposed that he was receiving her last confession, "Wilt thou be mine? I can even yet save thee." She looked steadily at him. "Begone, demon, or I denounce thee." He smiled, a horrible smile. "They will not believe thee. Thou wilt but add scandal to guilt. Answer quickly, wilt thou be mine?" "What hast thou done with my Phoebus?" "He is dead," said the priest. At this moment the miserable archdeacon raised his head mechanically and saw, at the opposite side of the square, on the balcony of the Gondelaurier house, the captain standing by fleur-de-lis. He staggered, passed his hand over his eyes, looked again, muttered a malediction, and all his features were violently contorted. "Well, then, die thou," said he between his teeth. "No one shall have thee." Then, raising his hand over the gypsy, he exclaimed in a sepulchral voice, "Go thy way now, lingering soul, and may God have mercy upon thee." This was the signal given by the priest to the executioner. The executioner's assistants approached the gypsy girl to bind her hands once more. The unhappy creature, at the moment of remounting the fatal cart, raised her dry red eyes to heaven. All at once she uttered a terrible cry, a cry of joy. Yonder, on that balcony at the corner of the Place, she had just caught sight of him, her friend, her lord, Phoebus, the other apparition of her life. The judge had lied. The priest had lied. It was he indeed. She couldn't doubt it. He was there, handsome, alive, dressed in his brilliant uniform, his plume on his head, his sword by his side. "Phoebus!" she cried, "my Phoebus!" And she tried to stretch towards him, arms trembling with love and rapture. But they were bound. Then she saw the captain knit his brows. A fine young woman, leaning upon his arm, looked at him with scornful lip and angry eye. Then Phoebus uttered some words which did not reach her, and then he and the lady both disappeared precipitately through the window of the balcony, which closed after them. "Phoebus!" she cried wildly, "dost thou too believe it?" A monstrous thought had dawned upon her. She recollected that she had been condemned for the murder of Phoebus de Chateaupert. She had borne up until now, but this last blow was too severe. She fell senseless upon the ground. "Come," said the executioner, "carry her to the cart and make an end of it." No one had observed in the gallery of statues of the kings, carved just above the arches of the portal, a strange-looking spectator, who until now watched all that passed with such impassiveness, a neck so outstretched, a visage so deformed, that he might have been taken for one of the stone monsters through whose jaws the long gutters of the cathedral have disgorged themselves for 6 centuries past. This spectator had missed nothing that had taken place since midday in front of the portal of Notre Dame, and at the very beginning, without anyone noticing him, he had securely fastened to one of the small columns of the gallery a strong knotted rope, the other end of which trailed on the top of the steps below. This done, he began to look on tranquilly, whistling from time to time when a blackbird flitted past. Suddenly he threw his leg over the balustrade of the gallery, gripped the rope with his feet, his knees and his hands. Then he was seen to slide down the façade as a drop of rain slides down a window pane, run up to the 2 sub-executioners with the speed of a cat just dropped from a housetop, knock them down with 2 enormous fists, pick up the gypsy with one hand as a child might a doll, and leap, at one bound into the church, lifting the girl over his head and shouting in a tremendous voice, "Sanctuary!" This was done with such rapidity that had it been night, the whole might have been seen by the glare of a single flash of lightning. "Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" repeated the crowd, and the clapping of 10,000 hands made Quasimodo's only eye sparkle with joy and pride. This shock restored the prisoner to her senses. She raised her eyelids, looked at Quasimodo, then closed them again suddenly as if terrified at her deliverer. The executioners and the whole escort were confounded. Within the precincts of Notre Dame the condemned was inviolable. The cathedral was a recognized place of refuge. All temporal jurisdiction expired upon its threshold. Quasimodo had stopped under the great portal. His broad feet seemed to rest as solidly upon the floor of the church as the heavy Roman pillars themselves. His big, bushy head was buried between his shoulders like the head of a lion, which also has a mane but no neck. He held the trembling girl suspended in his hands like a piece of white drapery, but he carried her with as much care as if he feared that he should break or injure her. He seemed to feel that a thing so delicate, exquisite, and precious was not made for such hands as his. At times he looked as if he dared not touch her, even with his breath. Then, all at once, he would press her close in his arms to his angular breast, as his own, his treasure, as her mother might have done. His gnome-like eye, resting upon her, flooded her with tenderness, grief, and pity, and was suddenly lifted, flashing fire. Then the women laughed and wept. The crowd stamped their feet with enthusiasm, for at that moment Quasimodo had a beauty of his own. Then, too, there was something touching in the protection afforded by a being so deformed to a being so unfortunate, in the circumstance of a poor girl condemned to death being saved by Quasimodo. They were the two extremes, natural and social wretchedness, coming into contact and aiding each other. However, after a few moments of triumph, Quasimodo plunged abruptly into the church with his burden. The people, fond of any display of prowess, sought him with their eyes under the gloomy nave, regretting that he had so quickly withdrawn from their acclamations. All at once he was seen to reappear at one extremity of the gallery of the kings of France. He ran along it like a madman, holding his conquests aloft and shouting, "Sanctuary!" Fresh plaudits burst from the multitude. Having traversed the gallery, he plunged again into the interior of the church. A moment later he reappeared upon the upper platform, with the gypsy still in his arms, still running wildly along, still shouting, "Sanctuary!" And the throng applauded. Finally he made a third appearance on the top of the tower of the great bell. From thence he seemed to show exultingly to the whole city her whom he had saved, and his thundering voice, that voice so rarely heard by anyone, and never by himself, thrice repeated with frenzy that pierced the very clouds, "Sanctuary! Sanctuary! Sanctuary!" Claude Frollo was no longer in Notre Dame when his adopted son thus abruptly cut the fatal knot in which the unhappy Archdeacon had bound the gypsy girl and caught himself. On returning into the sacristy, he had torn off the alb, cope, and stole, flung them all into the hands of the amazed verger, fled through the private door of the cloister, ordered a boatman of the Terrain to carry him over to the left bank of the Seine, and plunged in among the hilly streets of the university, going he knew not whither, meeting at every step parties of men and women hastening gaily towards the Pont Saint-Michel, in the hope that they might still arrive in time to see the witch hanged, pale, wild, more troubled, more blind, and more fierce than a night-bird let loose and pursued by a troop of children in broad daylight. He knew not where he was, what he did, whether he dreamed. He went forward, walking, running, taking any street at random for hour after hour. In the night he found that his feet had brought him back to the Place du Parvis. When he arrived he shrunk back, and dared not lift his eyes toward the fatal edifice. "Oh," he murmured to himself, "is it possible that such a thing took place here today, this very morning?" Every town in the Middle Ages had its places of refuge, or sanctuaries. When once he had set foot within the asylum, the criminal was sacred, but he must beware of leaving it. One step outside the sanctuary and he fell back into the flood. Churches had usually a small retreat prepared for the reception of the suppliants. At Notre Dame it was a tiny chamber, situated on the roof of the side aisle beneath the flying buttresses. Here it was that after his wild and triumphal race along the towers and galleries, Quasimodo deposited La Esmeralda. When the breathless and dishevelled bell-ringer laid her down in the cell of refuge, when she felt his clumsy hands gently untying the cord that had cut into her arms, she experienced that kind of shock which startles out of their sleep those on board a ship that runs aground in the middle of the dark night. Her ideas awoke also, and returned to her one by one. She saw that she was in Notre Dame. She remembered having been snatched from the hands of the executioner, that Phoebus was living, that Phoebus loved her no longer. She turned to Quasimodo, who remained standing before her, and whose aspect frightened her, and said to him, "Why did you save me?" He looked anxiously at her, as if striving to guess what she said. She repeated her question. He then gave her another look of profound sadness and fled. She was amazed. A few moments later he returned, bringing a bundle which he laid at her feet. It contained apparel which certain charitable women had left for her at the threshold of the church. Then she looked down at herself, saw that she was almost naked, and blushed. Life had returned. Quasimodo seemed to participate in this feeling of modesty. Covering his eye with his broad hand, he again departed, but with lingering steps. She hastily dressed herself. She had scarcely finished before Quasimodo returned. He carried a basket under one arm and a mattress under the other. This basket contained a bottle, bread, and some other provisions. He set the basket on the ground and said, "Eat." He spread out the mattress on the flagstones and said, "Sleep." It was his own meal, his own bed, that the bell-ringer had brought her. The Egyptian lifted her eyes to his face to thank him, but could not utter a word. The poor fellow was absolutely hideous. She drooped her head with a thrill of horror. Then he said to her, "I frighten you. I am very ugly, am I not? Do not look at me, only listen to me. In the daytime you will stay here. At night you can walk about all over the church, but stir not a step out of it, either by night or by day. You would be lost. They would kill you, and I should die." Moved by his words, she raised her head to reply, but he was gone. She felt a hairy, shaggy head pushed between her hands upon her lap. It was the poor goat, the nimble Jali. The gypsy covered it with kisses. On the following morning she perceived on awaking at the window an object that frightened her, the unfortunate face of Quasimodo. She involuntarily closed her eyes, then heard a rough voice saying very gently, "Do not be afraid. I am your friend. I came to watch you sleep. It does not hurt you, does it, that I should come and see you sleep? What does it
matter to you if I am here when you have your eyes shut? Now I am going. Stay. I have placed myself behind the wall. Now you may open your eyes again."
The gypsy, touched by him, opened her eyes. He was no longer at the window. She went to it and saw the poor hunchback crouching in a corner of the wall, in a sad and resigned attitude. She made an effort to overcome the repugnance with which he inspired her. "Come hither," she said to him, gently. From the motion of her lips, Quasimodo thought she was bidding him to go away. Then he rose up and retreated, limping slowly, with drooping head, not venturing to raise to the young girl his face full of despair. "Come hither, I say," cried she. But he continued to move off. Then she darted out of the cell, ran to him, and took hold of his arm. On feeling her touch, Quasimodo trembled in every limb. He lifted a beseeching eye, and finding that she was trying to draw him with her, his whole face beamed with joy and tenderness. She tried to make him enter her cell, but he persisted in remaining on the threshold.
"No, no," said he. "The owl enters not the nest of the lark."
Then she threw herself gracefully upon her couch, with her goat fast asleep at her feet. Both were motionless for several minutes, contemplating in silence, he so much grace, she so much ugliness. He was the first to break silence.
"So you were telling me to return?"
She nodded affirmatively and said, "Yes." He understood the motion of her head.
"Alas," said he,
as though hesitating whether to finish,
I am deaf."
"Poor man," exclaimed the gypsy girl, with an expression of kindly pity. He smiled sorrowfully.
"You think that was all I lacked, do you not? Yes, I am deaf. That is the way I am made. It is horrible, is it not? And you are beautiful."
Smiling, she asked, "Tell me why you saved me." He watched her attentively as she spoke.
"I understand," he answered. "You ask me why I saved you. You have forgotten a poor wretch that tried to carry you off one night, a poor wretch to whom you brought relief the very next day on their infamous pillory. A drop of water and a little pity. That is more than I can repay with my life. You have forgotten that poor wretch, but he remembers."
She listened to him with deep emotion. A tear started in the bell ringer's eye, but it did not fall. He seemed to make it a point of honor to repress it.
"Listen,"
he resumed, when he no longer feared that this tear would fall.
"We have here very high towers. A man who should fall from one would be dead before he touched the pavement. When it shall please you to have me to fall, you will not have to even utter a word. A glance will suffice."
Then he rose. This odd being, unhappy as the gypsy was, still aroused some compassion in her breast. She motioned to him to remain.
"No, no," said he, "I must not stay too long. I am not at my ease. It is out of pity that you do not turn away your eyes. I will go where I can see you without your seeing me. It will be better so." He drew from his pocket a small metal whistle. "There," said he, "when you want me, when you wish me to come, when you do not feel too much horror at the sight of me, use this whistle. I can hear this sound." He laid the whistle on the ground and fled. Meanwhile, public rumour had acquainted the Archdeacon with the miraculous manner in which the gypsy girl had been saved. When he learned this, he felt he knew not what. He had reconciled his mind to the thought of La Esmeralda's death, and thus he had become calm. He had touched the depths of possible grief. The human heart cannot contain more than a certain quantity of despair. When the sponge is thoroughly soaked, the sea may pass over it without its imbibing one tear more. Now, Esmeralda being dead, the sponge was filled to its utmost. All was over for Dom Claude upon this earth. But to feel that she was alive, and Phoebus also, that was the recommencement of torture, of pangs, of vicissitudes, of life. And Dom Claude was weary of all that. When this piece of intelligence reached him, he shut himself in his cloister cell. He appeared neither at the conferences of the chapter nor at the services in the church. He closed his door against everyone, even the bishop. He kept himself thus immured for several weeks. He was thought to be ill, and so indeed he was. He passed whole days with his face pressed against the casement of his window. From that window, situated in the cloister, he could see the cell of Esmeralda. He often saw herself, with her goat, sometimes with Quasimodo. He asked himself what motive could have urged Quasimodo to save her. His nights were frightful. Since he knew the gypsy girl to be alive, he figured to himself the young girl in her slight chemise, with a rope about her neck, with bare feet and uncovered shoulders, almost naked, as he had seen her upon the last day. These voluptuous images made him clench his hands and sent a shiver through his frame. One night in particular they so cruelly inflamed his priestly virgin blood that he tore his pillow with his teeth, leaped from bed, threw a surplice over his nightrobe, and went out of his cell with his lamp in hand, half naked, wild, with flaming eyes. He knew where to find the key of the door, opening from the cloister into the church. That night La Esmeralda had fallen asleep in her little chamber, dreaming as usual of Phoebus. She thought she heard some noise about her. Her sleep was light and restless, the sleep of a bird. The slightest thing awakened her. She opened her eyes. The night was very dark, yet she discerned at the little window a face regarding her. There was a lamp which cast its light upon this apparition. The moment that it perceived itself to be observed by La Esmeralda, it blew out the lamp. Nevertheless, the young girl had caught a glimpse of its features. Her eyelids dropped with terror. "Oh," said she in a faint voice, "the priest!" All her past misfortune flashed upon her mind, and she fell back, frozen upon her bed with horror. A moment after, she felt a contact the whole length of her body, which made her shudder so violently that she started up in bed wide awake and furious. The priest had glided to her side and clasped her in his arms. She strove to cry out, but could not. "Begone! Begone! Monster, begone! Assassin!" said she, in a voice low and faltering with anger and horror. "Mercy, mercy!" murmured the priest, pressing his lips to her shoulders. She seized his bald head with both her hands by the remaining hairs, and strove to repel his kisses, as if he had been biting her. "Mercy!" repeated the wretched man. "Didst thou but know what is my love for thee! 'Tis fire, 'tis molten lead, 'tis 1,000 daggers in my heart!" and he held back both her arms with superhuman strength. Quite desperate, "Let me go," she cried, "or I spit in thy face." He released her. "Vilify me, strike me, be cruel, do what thou wilt, but have mercy, love me." Then she struck him with the fury of a child. She drew up her beautiful hands to tear his face. "Begone, begone! Love me, have pity," cried the poor priest, rolling upon her and answering her blows with caresses. All at once she felt that he was overpowering her. "There must be an end of this," said he, grinding his teeth. She was conquered, crushed and quivering in his arms. She felt a lascivious hand wandering over her. She made a last effort and shrieked, "Help! Help me!" But nothing came. Only Jali was awake and bleated piteously. "Silence!" said the panting priest. Suddenly, in the midst of her struggles, as the gypsy retreated upon the floor, her hand came in contact with something cold and metallic. It was Quasimodo's whistle. She seized it with a convulsion of hope, put it to her lips, and blew with all her remaining strength. The whistle sounded clear, shrill, piercing. "What is that?" said the priest. Almost at the same instant, he felt himself lifted by a vigorous arm. The cell was dark. He could not clearly distinguish who it was that held him thus, but he heard teeth clenching with rage, and there was just light enough mingled with the darkness for him to see, shining over his head, a large cutlass. The priest thought he could discern the form of Quasimodo. He supposed it could be no other. He threw himself upon the arm that held the cutlass, crying, "Quasimodo!" forgetting in that moment of distress that Quasimodo was deaf. In the twinkling of an eye, the priest was thrown upon the floor and felt a knee of lead weighing upon his breast. By the angular imprint of that knee, he recognized Quasimodo. But what was he to do? How was he to make himself known to the other? Night made the deaf man blind. He was lost. The young girl, devoid of pity as an enraged tigress, did not interfere to save him. The cutlass approached his head. The moment was critical. Suddenly, his adversary appeared to hesitate. "No blood upon her," said he in an undertone. It was, in fact, the voice of Quasimodo. Then the priest felt the great hand dragging him by the foot out of the cell. It was there he was to die. Luckily for him, the moon had been risen for a few moments. When they had cleared the door of the chamber, its pale rays fell upon the features of the priest. Quasimodo looked in his face. A tremor came over him. He relaxed his hold of the priest and shrank back. The gypsy, having come forward to the threshold of her cell, was surprised to see them suddenly change parts, for now it was the priest who threatened and Quasimodo who implored. The priest, heaping gestures of anger and reproof upon the deaf man, violently motioned to him to withdraw. The deaf man bowed his head, then came and knelt before the gypsy's door. "Monseigneur," said he, in a tone of gravity and resignation, "afterwards you will do what you please, but kill me first." So saying, he presented his cutlass to the priest, and the priest, beside himself, rushed forward to grasp it, but the girl was quicker than he. She snatched the cutlass from Quasimodo's hand and burst into a frantic laugh. "Approach!" said she to the priest. She held the blade aloft. The priest hesitated. She would certainly have struck. "Thou durst not approach now, coward!" she exclaimed. Then she added, in a pitiless accent, and well knowing that it would be plunging a red-hot iron into the heart of the priest, "Ah, I know that Phoebus is not dead." The priest overthrew Quasimodo with a kick, and plunged, trembling with rage, under the vault of the staircase. When he had gone, Quasimodo picked up the whistle that had just saved the gypsy. "It was growing rusty," said he, as he gave it to her, and then he left her alone. The young girl, overpowered by this violent scene, fell exhausted upon her couch and burst into a flood of tears. As for the priest, he had groped his way back into his cell. It was done. Dom Claude was jealous of Quasimodo. He repeated pensively to himself his fatal sentence, "No one shall have her." The rumour of Esmeralda's strange escape had also reached that part of the city which provided shelter for all the beggars and thieves of Paris. The girl was a gypsy, after all. She was of their breed, one of their own. These outlaws and scoundrels were commonly called truands. One evening, more tumult than usual was going on in the truands' tavern. They were drinking deeper and swearing louder. Without, in the square, were numerous groups, conversing in low tones, as if some great plot was hatching, while here and there a knave squatted down, whetting some wicked-looking blade upon the pavement. Within the tavern the leader of the truands was addressing his fellows. "Brethren, we go upon a noble expedition. We are valiant fellows. Besiege the church, force the doors, bring away the pretty girl, save her from the judges, save her from the priests. Dismantle the cloister, burn the bishop in his house. We will do all that in less time than it takes a burgomaster to eat a spoonful of soup. Our cause is just. We'll plunder Notre Dame, and that's all about it. Now, silence. To march through Paris. The torches must not be lighted till we reach Notre Dame. March!" 10 minutes later, the horsemen of the watch fled in terror before a long procession of men descending in darkness and silence through the winding streets of the city. That same night Quasimodo slept not. He mounted to the top of the northern tower, and there, placing his well-closed dark lantern on the leads, took a survey of Paris. The night was very dark. While his only eye was thus hovering over that horizon of mist and darkness, the ringer felt within him an inexpressible uneasiness. All at once, while he was reconnoitring the great city with that eye which nature, as if by way of compensation, had made so piercing that it almost supplied the deficiency of other organs in Quasimodo, it struck him that there was something unusual in the appearance of the outline of the city, that there was some movement, that it undulated before the eye like waves of a river, or the heads of a crowd in motion. He redoubled his attention. The movement appeared to be towards the church. He seemed to see advancing toward him a mist, peopled with men, to see shades moving in the shade. Then his fears returned. The idea of an attempt against the girl presented itself again to his mind. Should he awaken her, assist her to escape? Which way? The streets were beset. Behind the church was the river. There was no boat, no egress. There was but one measure to be taken: to meet death on the threshold of Notre Dame, to resist at least until some assistance came, if any were to come, and not to disturb the sleep of Esmeralda. The crowd seemed to be increasing every moment in the parvis. A frightful troop of men and women in rags, armed with scythes, pikes, pruning hooks, partisans, the 1,000 points of which all glittered. Here and there black pitchforks formed horns to those hideous visages. He had a confused recollection of that populace, and thought he recognized all the heads which a few months before had saluted him Pope of the Fools. Quasimodo picked up his lantern and descended to the platform between the towers, to obtain a nearer view and to arrange his means of defence. The Truand king turned about, and cast his eyes over his army, a ferocious multitude whose eyes flashed almost like the pikes. After a moment's pause, "Forward, my sons!" cried he. "To your work, locksmiths!" 30 stout men, fellows with brawny limbs and the faces of blacksmiths, sprang from the ranks with hammers, pincers, and iron crows on their shoulders. They advanced towards the principal door of the church, ascended the steps, and directly they were to be seen stooping down under the pointed arches of the portal, heaving at the door with pincers and levers. A crowd of truands followed them to assist or look on, so that the whole steps were covered with them. The door, however, stood firm. "Diable, but she's hard and headstrong," said one. "She's old, and her gristles are tough," said another. "Courage, my friends," cried Clopin.
There was suddenly a frightful noise, which at that moment resounded behind him. He turned round. An enormous beam had just fallen from on high, crushing a dozen of the truands upon the church steps, and rebounding upon the pavement with the sound of a piece of artillery, breaking legs here and there in the crowd of vagabonds who sprang aside with cries of terror. In a twinkling the narrow precincts of the Parvis were cleared. The locksmiths, though protected by the deep arches of the portal, abandoned the door, and Clopin himself fell back to a respectful distance from the church. "To your work, locksmiths!" cried Clopin. "Come, force the door!" Nobody advanced a step. "Beard and belly," said Clopin. "Here are men afraid of a rafter." An old lockpicker now addressed him. "Captain, it's not the rafter that we care about, 'tis the door. That's all sewed up with iron bars. The pincers can do nothing with it." "What should you have, then, to burst it open with?" asked Clopin. "Oh, we should have a battering ram." The King of Tunis ran bravely up to the formidable piece of timber and set his foot upon it. "Here's one," cried he. "The cannons have sent it to you." The truand recovered courage, and soon the heavy timber, picked up like a feather by 200 vigorous arms, was driven with fury against the great door which had before been attacked. Seen thus, by the sort of half-light which the few scattered torches of the truand cast over the place, the long beam, borne along by that multitude of men, rushing on with its extremity pointed against the church, looked like some monstrous animal with innumerable legs, running head foremost to attack a stone giantess. At the shock given by the beam, the half-metal door sounded like an immense drum. It was not burst in, but the whole cathedral shook, and in its deepest recesses could be heard rumblings. At the same moment a shower of great stones began to fall from the upper part of the façade upon the assailants. Nearly all of them took effect, and already the dead and wounded were thickly strewn, bleeding and panting under the feet of the assailants, who, now grown furious, filled up instantly and without intermission the places of the disabled. The long beam continued, battering the door with periodical strokes like the clapper of a bell, the stones to shower down, the door to groan. The listener has undoubtedly not waited till this time to divine that this unexpected resistance, which had exasperated the truand, proceeded from Quasimodo. Accident had unfortunately favoured but too well the brave deaf-mute. When he had descended upon the platform between the towers, his ideas were all in confusion. He ran to and fro along the gallery for some minutes like one insane, beholding from above the compact mass of the truand ready to throw themselves against the church, demanding of the devil or of God to save the gypsy. What was to be done? All at once he recollected that some masons had been at work all day repairing the wall, the timber work, and the roofing of the southern tower. This was a flash of light. The wall was of stone, the roof was of lead, the timber work of wood. Quasimodo ran to this tower. The lower chambers were, in fact, full of materials. There were piles of rough blocks of stone, sheets of lead rolled up, bundles of laths, heavy beams already notched with a saw, heaps of rubbish, in short, an arsenal complete. Time pressed. The pikes and hammers were at work below. With the strength multiplied tenfold by the sense of danger, he seized one of the beams, the heaviest and longest. He managed to push it through one of the loopholes. Then, grasping it again outside the tower, he shoved it over the outer angle of the balustrade surrounding the platform, and launched it into the abyss. Quasimodo saw the truands scattered by the fall of the beam like ashes at the breath of a child. He took advantage of their fright, and while they fixed their superstitious gaze upon the immense log fallen from heaven, and while they peppered the stone saints of the portal with the discharge of bolts and bullets, Quasimodo was silently piling up rubbish, rough blocks of stone, and even the masons' bags of tools on the edge of that balustrade from which the beam had already been hurled. Thus, as soon as they began to batter the great door, the shower of blocks of stone began to fall, and it seemed to them that the church was demolishing itself over their heads. The beggars, meanwhile, did not lose courage. The massive door which they were so furiously assailing had already trembled more than 20 times beneath the weight of their oaken battering ram, multiplied by the strength of 100 men. Quasimodo felt that the great door was yielding. Although he did not hear it, each stroke of the battering ram reverberated in the caverns of the church and within him. From above he beheld the truants, full of exultation and rage, shaking their fists at the dark front of the edifice, and he coveted for the gypsy girl and himself the wings of the owls that were flocking away affrighted over his head. His shower of stone blocks was not sufficient to repel the assailants. At this moment of anguish, he noticed a little below the balustrade from which he had been crushing the truants 2 long stone gutters, which disgorged immediately over the great door. The inner orifice of these gutters was on a level with the platform. An idea struck him. He ran to his bell-ringer's lodge for a faggot, laid over the faggot many bundles of laths and rolls of lead, ammunition of which he had not yet made any use, and having placed this pile in front of the hole of the 2 gutters, he set fire to it with his lantern. All at once, at the moment when they were crowding about the battering ram for a final effort, each one holding in his breath and stiffening his muscles so as to give full force to the decisive stroke, a howl, more frightful still than that which had burst forth and expired beneath the beam, arose from the midst of them. Those who did not cry out, those who were still alive, looked. 2 jets of melted lead were falling from the top of the edifice into the thickest of the rabble. That sea of men had gone down under the boiling metal, which at the 2 points where it fell had made 2 black and smoking holes in the crowd, like hot water thrown on snow. There were to be seen dying wretches, burned half to a cinder, and moaning with agony. Around the 2 principal jets there were drops of that horrible rain, which scattered upon the assailants and entered their skulls like fiery gimlet points. It was a ponderous fire, which riddled the crowd with 1,000 hailstones. The outcry was heart-rending. They fled in disorder, hurling the beam upon the dead bodies, the boldest as well as the most timid, and the parvis was left empty a second time. All eyes were raised to the top of the church. They beheld there an extraordinary sight. On the crest of the highest gallery, higher than the central rose window, was a great flame ascending between the 2 towers, with whirlwinds of sparks, a great flame, irregular and furious, a tongue of which, by the action of the wind, was at times borne into the smoke. Underneath that flame, underneath the trifoliated balustrade showing darkly against its glare, 2 monster-headed gutters were vomiting incessantly that burning shower, whose silver stream shone out against the darkness of the lower façade. As they approached the earth, these 2 jets of liquid lead spread out into myriads of drops like water, sprinkled from the many holes of a watering pot. Above the flame, the huge towers, 2 sides of each of which were visible in sharp outline, the one wholly black, the other wholly red, seemed still more vast by all the immensity of shadow which they cast even into the sky. Their innumerable sculptured demons and dragons assumed a formidable aspect. The restless, flickering light from the unaccountable flame made them seem as if they were moving. There were griffins, which seemed to be laughing, gargoyles to be heard yelping, salamanders puffing fire, and among the monsters, thus awakened from their stony slumber by this unearthly flame, by this clamour, there was one who walked about, and who was seen from time to time, passing across the flowing front of the pile like a bat before a torch. A cry of horror arose from the truants. "Vengeance!" cried Clopin. "Sack!" answered the multitude. "Assault! Assault!" Then there was a prodigious howling, mixed with all languages, all dialects, and all tones of voice. Their rage found them ladders, multiplied their torches, and in a few minutes Quasimodo, in confusion and despair, saw a frightful swarm ascending from all sides to the assault of Notre Dame. Those who had not ladders had knotted ropes, and those who had not ropes climbed up by means of the projections of the sculpture. They clung to one another's rags, no means of resisting this rising tide of frightful visages. Fury seemed to writhe in those ferocious countenances. Their dirty foreheads streamed with sweat, their eyes flashed. All these varieties of grimace and ugliness beset Quasimodo. It seemed as if some other church had sent her gorgons, her dogs, her medieval creatures, her demons, all her most fantastic carvings, to assail Notre Dame. It was a coat of living monsters, covering the stone monsters of the facade. Quasimodo, powerless against so many enemies, trembling for the gypsy, watched those furious faces approach, nearer and nearer to his gallery, and implored a miracle from heaven as he wrung his arms in despair. Louis XI, King of France, had that day arrived in Paris. He was to set out again the next day but one for his citadel of Montis-les-Tours. His visits to his good city of Paris were rare and short, as he did not there feel himself surrounded by a sufficient number of trapdoors, gibbets, and Scottish archers. He had come that day to sleep at the Bastille. His great chamber at the Louvre, with its huge chimney-piece loaded with 12 great beasts and 13 great prophets, and his grand bed, 11 feet by 12, were little to his taste. He felt himself lost amidst all those grandeurs. This burgher king preferred the Bastille, with a chamber and a bed of humbler dimensions. Besides, the Bastille was stronger than the Louvre. This little chamber, which the king reserved for himself in that famous state prison, was also tolerably spacious, occupying the topmost floor of a turret in the keep. At this moment the chamber was very dark. The curfew had sounded an hour before, night was come, and there was but one flickering wax candle set on the table to light the table at which the king was sitting. Suddenly the door opened, and gave passage to a new personage who rushed all aghast into the chamber, crying, "Sire, sire, there's a sedition of the populace in Paris!" The grave countenance of Louis XI was contracted. "So, then," said the king, "speak out, sir. There is a commotion among the louts in our good city of Paris?" "Yes, sire." "Are they in force?" "Yes, assuredly, sire." "How many?" "At least 6,000. "Are they armed?" "Yes, sire, with scythes, pikes, hackbutts, pickaxes, all sorts of very dangerous weapons." "What does this mean?" said he. "Sire, a witch has been condemned to death by your court of parliament. She has taken refuge in Notre Dame. The people wish to take her thence by main force. Monsieur the Provost and Monsieur the Knight of the Watch, who are come straight from the spot, are here to contradict me if I speak not the truth. It is Notre Dame that the people are besieging." Ah, said the king in a low tone, pale and trembling with wrath. "Notre Dame, they are besieging Our Lady, my good mistress, in her own cathedral." The king appeared to reflect deeply, then said, "Well, exterminate the people and hang the sorceress. If the witch be still in Notre Dame, sire, is she to be taken despite the sanctuary?" "Pasque Dieu, the sanctuary," said the king, scratching his ear. "And yet this woman must be hanged." He made the sign of the cross. "Make all speed. Take Monsieur de Chateaupert with you. Sound the tocsin, crush the populace, hang the sorceress. That's settled. You yourself will defray the costs of the execution. Report to me upon it." Quasimodo, the brave deaf man, assailed on all sides, had lost, if not all courage, at least all hope of saving, not himself, he thought not of himself, but the gypsy girl. He ran distractedly along the gallery. Notre Dame was on the point of being carried by the truant. All at once a great galloping of horses filled the neighbouring streets, and with a long file of torches and a dense column of horsemen, lances and bridles lowered, these furious sounds came rushing into the place like a hurricane. "France! France! Cut down the knaves! Chateaupert to the rescue! Provostry! Provostry!" The Chouan in terror faced about. Quasimodo, who heard nothing, saw the drawn swords, the flambeaux, the spearheads, all that cavalry, at the head of which he recognized Captain Phoebus. He saw the confusion of the vagabonds, the terror of some of them, the perturbation of the stoutest-hearted amongst them, and this unexpected succour so much revived his own energies that he hurled back from the church the first assailants, who were already climbing into the gallery. It was, in fact, the king's troops who had arrived. The Chouans bore themselves bravely. They defended themselves desperately. The king's horsemen, amid whom Phoebus de Chateaupert bore himself valiantly, gave no quarter, and they who escaped the thrust of the lance fell by the edge of the sword. The Chouans, ill-armed, foamed and bit with rage and despair. Men, women, and children threw themselves upon the cruppers and chests of the horses, and clung to them like cats with tooth and nail. Others struck the archers in the face with their torches. Others thrust their iron hooks into the necks of the horsemen and dragged them down. They slashed in pieces those who fell. One of them was seen with a large glittering scythe, with which for a long time he mowed the legs of the horses. He was frightful. He was singing a song with a nasal intonation, taking long and sweeping strokes with his scythe. At each stroke he described round him a great circle of severed limbs. He advanced in this manner into the thickest of the cavalry, with the quiet slowness, the regular motion of the head and drawing of the breath of a harvester mowing a field of corn. This was Clopin Trouillefou. He fell by the shot of an arquebus. At length the vagabonds gave way. Exhaustion, want of good weapons, the fright of the surprise, and the spirited charge of the king's troops all combined to overpower them. They broke through the line of their assailants and fled in all directions, leaving the parvis strewn with dead. When Quasimodo beheld this rout, he fell on his knees and raised his hands to heaven. Then, intoxicated with joy, he ran and ascended with the swiftness of a bird to that cell, the approaches to which he had so gallantly defended. He had now but one thought. It was to kneel before her whom he had just saved for the second time. When he entered the cell, he found it empty. At the moment when the Chouan had attacked the church, Esmeralda was asleep. Soon the ever-increasing uproar around the edifice, and the plaintive bleating of her goat, which awoke before her, roused her from her slumbers. She sat up, listened, and looked about her. Then, frightened at the light and the noise, she had hurried from her cell to see what it was. The aspect of the square, the strange vision moving in it, the disorder of that nocturnal assault, that hideous crowd leaping like a cloud of frogs, half seen in the darkness, the croaking of that hoarse multitude, the few red torches dancing to and fro in the obscurity, like those meteors of the night that play over the misty surface of a marsh, all together seemed to her like some mysterious battle commenced between the phantoms of a witch's sabbath and the stone monsters of the church. Imbued from infancy with the superstitions of the Bohemian tribe, her first thought was that she had surprised in their magic revels the strange creatures peculiar to the night. Then she ran in terror to cower in her cell, and ask of her humble couch some less horrible vision. By degrees, however, the first vapours of terror gradually dispersed. From the constantly increasing din, and from other signs of reality, she discovered that she was beset not by spectres, but by human beings. Then her fear, though it did not increase, changed its nature. She had dreamed of the possibility of a popular rising to drag her from her asylum. The idea of once more losing life, hope, Phoebus, who still was ever present to her hopes, her extreme helplessness, all flight cut off, no support, her abandonment, her isolation. These thoughts and 1,000 others had overwhelmed her. She had fallen upon her knees with her head upon her couch and her hands clasped upon her head, apprehensive and trembling. And, gypsy, idolatrous, and heathen as she was, she began with sobs to implore mercy of the God of the Christians, and to pray to Our Lady, her protectress. For, even if one believes in nothing, there are moments in life when one is always of the religion of the temple nearest at hand. She remained thus prostrate for a very long time, trembling, in truth, more than she prayed, her blood running cold at the nearer and nearer approach of the breath of that furious multitude, ignorant of the nature of this outburst, of what was being plotted, of what they were doing, of what they wanted, but feeling a presentiment of some dreadful result. In the midst of this anguish she heard a footstep close to her. She looked up and saw a hooded figure. "Fear nothing," said a voice which was not unknown to her. "'Tis I." "Who are you?" asked she. The man lifted his hood. "Oh," faltered she, petrified. I knew well that it was he again. It was the priest. He looked like the ghost of himself. It was an effect of the moonlight. It seemed as if by that light one beholds only the spectres of objects. "Listen," said he, and she shuddered at the sound of that fatal voice which she had not heard for so long. He continued. He spoke with short and panting jerks, which betokened deep internal convulsions. "Listen, I have to talk with thee. Fate delivers us up into the hands of each other. Beyond this place and this night, nothing is to be foretold. Listen to me, then. I shall tell thee. First, talk to me not of thy Phoebus." As he spoke, he paced backward and forward like a man incapable of standing still, dragging her after him. "Talk not of him. Mark me, if thou utterest his name, I know not what I shall do, but it will be something terrible." Then, like a body which recovers its centre of gravity, he became motionless once more, but his words betrayed no less agitation. His voice grew lower and lower. "Turn not thy head aside so. Hearken to me. I can save thee, absolutely. Everything is prepared. Thou hast only to make it thy wish. As thou wilt, I can do." He broke off violently, and pointed toward the gibbet on the grave. "Choose between us," said he coolly. The priest stood motionless, his fingers still raised towards the gibbet, his attitude unchanged, like a statue. At length the gypsy said to him, "It is less horrible to me than you are." Then he let his arm drop slowly, and cast his eyes upon the ground in deep dejection. "I love you. Does that deserve no pity?" He hid his face in his hands. The young girl heard him weeping. She opened her lips to answer him. He threw himself on his knees before her, to receive with adoration the words, perhaps relenting, which were about to fall from her. She said to him, "You are an assassin." The priest seized her furiously in his arms, and burst into hideous laughter. "Well, yes, an assassin then," said he, "that I shall be." The priest dragged the girl by her arm to his own cloister cell in the north tower. There he left her, locked within, while he hastened in his frenzy to procure the final outcome of her fate. Alone, the girl listened to the noise of the siege, terrified. When the cries began to subside, as if the assailants had been dispersed, she began almost to have hope. But at that moment, when her hope grew with the dying away of the tumult outside, she heard the voice of the priest, that infernal voice, outside the cloister room, crying, "This way, Captain Phoebus de Chateaupert. She is here." When Quasimodo saw that the cell was empty, that the gypsy girl was no longer there, that while he'd been defending her she'd been abducted,
He took his head between his hands and stamped with rage and astonishment. Then he began to run all over the church, seeking his bohemian, howling strange cries at every corner, strewing his red hair on the pavement. It was just at the moment when the king's archers were making their victorious entry into Notre Dame, likewise in search of the gypsy girl. 20 times, 100 times over, did he make the circuit of the church, from one end to the other, from top to bottom, ascending, descending, running, calling, shouting, peeping, rummaging, ferreting, putting his head into every hole, thrusting a torch under every arch, desperate, mad, haggard, and moaning like a beast that has lost its mate. Never once did he think to search the Archdeacon's cell. At length, when he was sure, perfectly sure, that she was gone, that all was over, that she'd been stolen from him, he slowly went up the steps of the towers, those steps that he'd mounted so nimbly and triumphantly on the day he saved her. He now passed those same places with drooping head, voiceless, tearless, and hardly drawing breath. The church was again deserted and silent as before. The archers had quitted it to track the sorceress in the city. Quasimodo, left alone in that vast Notre Dame, but a moment before besieged and full of tumult, betook himself once more to the cell where the gypsy had slept for so many weeks under his protection. The unhappy man paced slowly round it, lifted up her couch, and looked underneath it, as if she could have been hidden between the mattress and the stones. He then shook his head and stood stupefied. All at once he furiously trampled upon his torch, and without word or sigh he rushed at full speed, head foremost against the wall, and fell senseless to the floor. When he recovered his senses, he threw himself on the bed, rolled upon it, and frantically kissed the place still warm where the damsel had lain. He remained thus for some minutes, as motionless as if life had fled. He then rose, bathed in sweat, panting, beside himself, and fell to beating his head against the wall with the frightful regularity of a pendulum, and the resolution of a man determined to dash out his brains. At length he sank exhausted a second time. Presently he crawled on his knees out of the cell, and crouched down opposite the door in an attitude of astonishment. He remained thus for more than an hour, his eye fixed upon the deserted cell, more gloomy and thoughtful than a mother seated between an empty cradle and a full coffin. He uttered not a word. Only at long intervals a sob shook violently his whole body, but it was a sobbing without tears, like summer lightning which makes no noise. It appears to have been then that, seeking amid his desolate thoughts to discover who could have been the unexpected abductor of the gypsy girl, he bethought himself of the Archdeacon. He recollected that Dom Claude alone possessed a key to the staircase leading to the cell. He remembered his nocturnal attempts upon La Esmeralda, the first of which he, Quasimodo, had assisted, the second of which he had prevented. He called to mind 1,000 details, and soon no longer doubted that the Archdeacon had taken the gypsy girl from him. Yet such was his reverence for the priest, gratitude, devotion, and love for that man were so deeply rooted in his heart, that they resisted even at this dire moment the fangs of jealousy and despair. He reflected that the Archdeacon had done this thing, and that sanguinary, deadly resentment, which he would have felt against any other individual, was turned in the poor deaf man's breast the moment when Claude Frollo was in question, into simply an increase of sorrow. At the moment that his thoughts were thus fixed on the priest, while the buttresses were beginning to whiten in the dawn, he descried on the upper gallery of Notre Dame, at the angle formed by the external balustrade which runs round the apsis, a figure walking. The figure was coming towards him. He recognized it. It was the Archdeacon. Claude walked with a slow, grave step.
He did not look before him as he went. He was going toward the northern tower, but his face was turned to the right bank of the Seine, and he carried his head erect, as if striving to obtain a view of something over the roofs. The deaf man, who was confounded by this sudden apparition, saw him disappear through the door of the staircase of the northern tower. Quasimodo rose and followed the Archdeacon. The priest, whose eyes were bent upon the town, was leaning his breast upon one of the four sides of the balustrade which looks upon the bridge of Notre Dame. Quasimodo stole with the stealthy tread of a wolf behind him to see at what he was thus gazing. The priest's attention was so completely absorbed elsewhere that he heard not the step of the hunchback near him. Quasimodo burned to ask him what he'd done with the gypsy girl, but the Archdeacon seemed at that moment to be out of the world. With his eyes steadily fixed on a certain spot, he remained motionless and silent. And in that silence and immobility there was something so formidable that the untamed bell-ringer shuddered at it and dared not intrude upon it. Only, and this was the one way of interrogating the Archdeacon, he followed the direction of his eye, and, thus guided, that of the unhappy hunchback fell upon the Place de Grève. He thus discovered what the priest was looking at. The ladder was set up against the permanent gibbet. There were a few people in the place and a number of soldiers. A man was dragging along the ground something white. This man stopped at the foot of the gibbet. Here something took place which Quasimodo could not clearly see, not because his only eye had not preserved its long range, but a group of soldiers prevented him seeing anything. Moreover, at that instant the sun appeared, and such a flood of light burst over the horizon that it seemed as if every point in Paris, spires, chimneys, gables, took fire all at once. Meantime the man began to mount the ladder. Quasimodo now saw him distinctly. He was carrying a woman on his shoulder, a young girl clad in white. That young girl had a noose about her neck. Quasimodo recognized her. It was she. The man reached the top of the ladder. There he arranged the noose. Here the priest, in order to see better, knelt upon the balustrade. Suddenly the man pushed away the ladder with his heel, and Quasimodo, who had not breathed for some moments, beheld the unfortunate child dangling at the end of the rope about 2 fathoms above the ground. The rope made several gyrations on itself, and horrible convulsions ran along the gypsy's body. At this most awful moment, a demoniacal laugh, a laugh such as can come only from one who is no longer human, burst from the livid visage of the priest. Quasimodo did not hear that laugh, but he saw it. The ringer retreated a few steps behind the Archdeacon, and then, suddenly rushing furiously upon him with his huge hands, he pushed him by the back into the abyss over which Dom Claude was leaning. The priest shrieked, "Damnation!" and fell. The spout above which he stood arrested his fall. He clung to it with desperate gripe, but at the moment when he opened his mouth to give a second cry, he beheld the formidable and avenging face of Quasimodo thrust over the edge of the balustrade above his head. Then he was silent. The abyss was beneath him, a fall of full 200 feet, and the pavement. Quasimodo had but to stretch out his hand to draw him from the gulf, but he did not so much as look at him. He was looking at the grave. He was looking at the gibbet. He was looking at the gypsy. The deaf man was leaning with his elbows on the balustrade at the very spot where the Archdeacon had been a moment before, and there, never turning his eye from the only object which existed for him at that moment, he was mute and motionless, like one struck by lightning, and a long stream of tears flowed in silence from that eye which until then had never shed but one. Quasimodo wept. At length the Archdeacon, foaming with rage and horror, became sensible that all was in vain. Finding everything under him giving way, having only his stiffened and crippled hands to hold by, the unhappy wretch closed his eyes and let go. He fell. Quasimodo watched him falling. A fall from such a height is seldom perpendicular. The Archdeacon, launched into space, fell at first with his head downward and his arms extended. Then he turned over several times. The wind blew him upon the roof of a house, where the miserable man broke some of his bones. Nevertheless, he was not dead when he reached it. The ringer could perceive him still make an effort to cling to the gable with his hands, but the slope was too steep, and he had no strength left. He glided rapidly down the roof like a loosened tile, then rebounded on the pavement. There he stirred no more. Quasimodo then lifted his eye to the gypsy, whose body, suspended from the gibbet, he beheld afar, quivering under its white robe, in the last agonies of death. Then he looked at the Archdeacon, stretched a shapeless mass at the foot of the tower, and he said with a sob that heaved his deep breast, "All that I have ever loved." On the night following the execution of Esmeralda, the executioner's men took down her body from the gibbet and, according to custom, carried it to the vault. When the judicial officers of the bishop came to remove the mangled body of the Archdeacon, Quasimodo had disappeared from Notre Dame. Indeed, he was never seen again, nor was it known what became of him. About a year and a half or 2 years after the events with which this history concludes, when search was made in the vault, there were found among all those hideous carcasses 2 skeletons, one of which held the other in a singular embrace. One of these skeletons, which was that of a woman, had still about it some tattered fragments of a garment that had once been white, and about the neck was a string of beads with a little silken bag, ornamented with green glass, which was open and empty. These objects were of so little value that the executioner had probably not cared to take them. The other, which held this one in a close embrace, was the skeleton of a man. It was noticed that the spine was crooked, the head depressed between the shoulders, and that one leg was shorter than the other. Moreover, there was no rupture of the vertebrae at the nape of the neck, whence it was evident that he had not been hanged. Hence the man to whom it belonged must have come thither and have died there. When they strove to detach the skeleton from the one it was embracing, it crumbled to dust.